Hey everyone, and welcome to the best of the week number 4. 3.5 hours of some of the best horror stories I could find on the internet. I've been putting in more work than ever into finding not only the best stories, but also posting a ton. I am currently posting twice every single day, and then also doing one of these long compilations every Monday night, so I hope you all have been enjoying that. I don't usually get super into analytics or anything, but our overall channel views are actually way up right now, and the channel is starting to grow again, and I'm just very excited for the future. Like I said, it reminds me of like back in the day when I was trying to grow this channel initially, and it's very reminiscent of that and very nostalgic feeling, and I'm having so much fun with it. I feel like we have yet to hit our peak, and I'm just really excited to see how far we can go. But anyway, if you do enjoy this video, please be sure to drop a like rating. On the last best of the week, I asked for 1,000 likes. Y'all crushed it. So this time, let's go for 1,200. I think if everybody took a quick second, we could do it. I'm trying to talk a little bit fast so we can get to the stories. Subscribing if you are new is also very much appreciated. Again, I post a lot of content, so if this is your thing, maybe this channel will interest you. Telling a friend is very much appreciated. Anyway, enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. My dad used to take me fishing at a secluded lake on my grandfather's property when I was growing up. I always looked forward to seeing my grandparents, going on hikes, sitting around the campfire, going fishing, and all of the adventures we used to have. I will never forget the day that I met her. I was 6 years old and my dad and I were setting up the lake with our bait and fishing poles. My dad cussed and took off his hat, glancing towards the still, steely blue water. I forgot the radio. Cody, you sit tight and I'll be right back, alright? Okay, Daddy. My dad turned and hurried back up the long slope that we had to descend every time we came to the lake. I sat there whistling, staring up at the sky and the massive, ancient trees that surrounded me. The wind blew, and the fresh, clean scent of nature reached my nostrils. I inhaled deeply, closing my eyes and tilting my head back. The birds were chirping, critters were scurrying, and everything seemed completely right. I had opened my eyes and sat there for a few more seconds before I actually noticed her, less than 6 feet away from me. My heart nearly leapt out of my throat and out of my gaping mouth. I was so startled. How had this thing so stealthily snuck up on me? And I only say thing now because that was how I perceived her at first. Only her head and shoulders were exposed, the rest of her hidden beneath the water. She was completely bald, but what looked to be tiny, dark green horns, dozens of them, protruding all over her scalp. The skin was as green as the leaves in the trees, her huge eyes taking up the majority of her face, completely black. She had no nose, only 2 slits above her mouth, which was long, flat, and slightly open as she gazed upon me. The two of us sat staring at each other in what felt like an eternity. I only looked away when I heard the country music blaring on my dad's radio. I looked back, watching as he appeared at the top of the slope. I glanced back at the water less than 2 seconds later, only to find that she was gone, leaving only ripples in her wake. I didn't tell my father about what I had seen. I wasn't sure if I had really seen anything real myself. That was the curiosity that drove me back to the lake later on that night. I had to creep barefoot through my grandparents' house, slowly edge the back door open, and walk quietly through the fog back down to the lake. I don't know why, but I brought a case of bait with me. She lived in the water like fish, so she definitely ate what they ate, right? I came to a stop several feet away from the dark water. The air was cool, and the moonlight shimmered on the surface of the lake I had come to love. I sat down and picked up a handful of worms. I tossed them into the water, waiting. Nothing. I pulled out my Nintendo DS and started playing a Mario game. Maybe I really had just been daydreaming, I figured. But I was already out here, so why not enjoy the night? I had apparently dozed off because I suddenly awoke to the sound of the Super Mario theme. Or what sounded eerily like the Super Mario theme. Wiping my eyes, I looked down at my DS. It was dead. I then looked down at the water. She was there, one scaly green, white arm out of the water. Her horny head resting on it as though she was bored. She was humming the music in a way that a human, or any other animal for that matter, ever could. Her black eyes were set upon me, never blinking. I sat there all night with her, the two of us simply keeping each other company. When the sun began to rise, I snapped out of my trance and stood up, dusting myself off. I have to go now, but I'll be back, okay? She made a strange sound, something that reminded me of a dog's whimper. I had a feeling that she didn't want me to go, but I knew I had to get back before my grandparents woke up. I began my ascent up the slope. When I glanced back, she was gone. I began to visit my grandparents more and more over the years. What used to be twice-a-month visits soon turned into every weekend, and even sometimes weekly if I could convince my dad to drive me over. My grandmother was delighted to have me around so much, but my grandfather had a look in his eye that I didn't like. It was as though he was suspecting something. I found myself wondering if he knew about my friend down the lake. She would never show her face if my dad, mom, or grandparents were there. She had eyes only for me, it seemed. I would bring her food, finding that she had an appetite for fish and shrimp, but wouldn't touch vegetables or desserts of any kind. She would hum different songs for me, and sometimes I would bring my iPod down to the lake, playing it low so that no one could hear it. She would hum my favorite songs back to me, and I would sit and talk with her, telling her about the different things going on in my life. One night when I was 12, I brought a women's magazine down to the lake. I whistled a long, low note, and she came like she always did. She placed both arms out of the water, her webbed, four-fingered hands clenching onto the wet soil as she looked innocently at me. Told my friends about you. They didn't believe me. Well, Tommy did, and he thinks that that you're kind of like a pet, I guess. I don't think he's right, but it got me thinking. You need a name. That way I have something to call you. I brought this magazine down to read a few to you. What do you think about Emily? She stared blankly at me, tilting her head as though she had no idea what the hell I was talking about. Okay, not Emily. Rebecca. No. What about Vanessa? She submerged for a moment and came back out, shooting water at me from her nostrils. Okay, not Vanessa. I don't like it either. I know a girl named Vanessa and, Kelly? No, how about Selena? She leaned forward slightly, turning her head sideways as though she wanted me to repeat what I had said. Selena? Do you like that one? Selena? She made a guttural sound and, for the first time, dipped into the water and hopped back out, performing a flip in the air. I saw her entire body for the first time. She was at least 7 feet long, built like a power forward with a powerful frame. She had thorny breasts and a scaly, powerful tail that looked serpentine rather than fish-like. When she landed back in the water, she sent a huge splash out onto the banks, drenched me in the process. I sputtered, wiping my face off and looking at hers, which seemed to be full of joy. Selena it is, then. Dakota, what are you doing down there? Selena immediately sank into the water and I turned, watching as my grandfather descended the slope. He was shirtless, walking in heavy boots and carrying a shotgun. I realized what it looked like. I was completely wet, sitting in the dark, and holding an open women's magazine. I felt my cheeks turn red as my grandfather's eyes scanned the water suspiciously. Boy, what the hell are you doing out here? Get up. Come get your ass back in bed. A few more years passed. I was 16 and had my first car, so I began to sneak over to my grandparents' place late at night when they were fast asleep. I came down to the lake one warm summer night with a sheet of paper in my hand. As I descended the slope towards the lake, I could have sworn I heard what sounded like a woman scream far off in the distance. Cougars, I thought. Knowing how terrible they could sound sometimes at night, I made my way down to the very edge of the water and touched it gently, running my hand through it. Selena? She took longer to come up than usual. When she did, she seemed different. I chalked it up to it being that maybe I had awakened her from her sleep, if she even did sleep. Hey Selena, I want to read you a poem. It's about a girl I like. Can you let me know what you think about it? I won't go into details about what I wrote, but Selena hummed a beautiful, haunting tune that whole time that I was reading. When I finished, we sat very close, simply looking at each other. I could hardly believe it. She really had understood my intention, my words, after all, and who they were meant for. I began to lean in, and she followed my example. I kissed her on the mouth and sat back, awaiting her reaction. She released air through her nostrils slightly, then leaned in again. I did as well and felt her hand clasp the back of my neck. I felt something slimy in her mouth and wondered if all girls' tongues felt that way. I was beginning to put my hand on her shoulder when I heard another loud, terrible scream. Selena pulled away from me, and we both glanced in the direction from which it had come. Then she vanished beneath the surface of the lake. "Hey, wait, come back," I whispered. A few minutes passed and she hadn't returned. I was beginning to think that I had messed up somehow, but just as I stood to leave, she resurfaced. She raised something out of the water, and I nearly puked. She was holding a soggy, waterlogged arm that had surely once belonged to a human. No, no, no. I turned and ran, looking back in terror at her. She watched me quietly, slowly lowering the corpse arm back into the water. I turned and kept running, never looking back. I didn't go and see her for weeks after that encounter. How could I have been so foolish? I couldn't fall in love with a creature. She wasn't natural, and she had clearly killed someone before. That could have been my body at the bottom of that lake. How could I have let my guard down, getting close enough to not only let her touch me, but kiss me as well? I could have easily been dragged in, but I hadn't. And as much as I suddenly hated myself for it, I knew that I was in love with Selena. I found myself thinking about her all day in class, and dreaming about her at night. I couldn't stay away. I needed to go and make things right. Get to the bottom of this. When I stealthily snuck into my grandparents' property again, I brought a pistol with me this time, just in case. I kept it tucked into the back of my belt, completely out of sight. I don't even know why. It's not like Selena knew what a gun was anyway. I made my way down to the murky water, keeping my distance this time. I sighed deeply and fell to my knees. Shakily, I called out, "Selena?" A few seconds later, she emerged and immediately shot water at me from her nostrils. She came flapping onto the land, clearly happy to see me, but I stumbled backwards, glaring angrily at her. Whoa, things aren't okay. Do you hear me? What you did to that person?" Selena gazed up at me. She slapped at the ground and pointed back at the water. She opened her mouth and made a stressed sound, then motioned back at the water again. "You must be insane if you think I'm going to go in the water with you. You killed someone. I never thought it'd be possible, but I can't go on with you knowing what you've done. I'm sorry, but I can't see you anymore, Selena. I'm so sorry." I turned and began walking away, my feet heavier than anything I had ever carried in my life. Selena behind me was making a desperate panting sound. "Dakota!" she screamed, and I spun around. The bullet hit me right in the shoulder. I fell to the ground, clutching at my wound, and stared in horror at my grandfather, who was emerging from a cluster of trees. He was covered in blood, holding his shotgun. "So you figured out what I've been doing out here, huh? Your little fish girlfriend there told you, didn't she?" "Papa, I..." I saw the canoe behind him resting at the edge of the water. A dead woman lay in it, chained to a couple of cinder blocks. Then it all made sense. Selena hadn't killed anyone. My grandfather did. I'm sorry, Cody, but you forced me to do this. It would break your grandmother's heart if she ever found out, and I ain't gonna let you do that. He raised his shotgun again, and I didn't have nearly enough time to grab my pistol. As soon as he fired, however, Selena leaped into the air, taking the bullet right into her chest. She then surged forward faster than anything I had ever seen, and converged on my grandfather. The two of them began struggling, my grandfather grabbing at her throat as they thrashed around the ground. I stood watching helplessly, and saw that somehow he was getting the upper hand. It seemed that either Selena was getting weaker from being out of the water so long, or else the bullet was taking its effect. I whipped out my pistol, aimed carefully, and fired twice. Both bullets missed their mark. I had wounded my dear Selena even more. Shaking, she suddenly lay still, and I cried out in agony as I fell to my knees. I no longer felt my gunshot wound. My soul was torn. My grandfather stood up, picking up his shotgun. Fuck. Now where was I? Selena grabbed his legs and thrust them roughly in opposite directions. My grandfather split in half from the crotch all the way up to his torso. The shotgun fell to the ground, and I dashed down to Selena. Hey, everything's gonna be okay. I'm gonna... Her black eyes were full of sorrow. She reached out and touched my face, leaving teal blood smudged upon it. She pulled me into an embrace, and I felt the life leave her body. I don't know how long I knelt there with her, but eventually I stood up and returned her body to the place she belonged, the lake. I left my grandfather's corpse lying there. My grandmother would surely find it, and the corpse of the woman he had murdered as well in the morning. I can say with certainty that I will never fall in love again. My heart will always be at the bottom of that lake. It was almost 2 a.m. before I was even halfway home after a rather long late night shift. Great, just my luck. What did I do to do this? I just want to go home. I yelled to myself in the car, along with a slew of cuss words as my dashboard began to flash like a Christmas light, and the engine began making noises that didn't sound like noises an engine should make. Not long after that, it began to smoke up, which an engine definitely shouldn't do. I managed to find a mechanic close enough to drive to before it completely broke down. So, how long do you think it'll take? I asked the mechanic, a scruffy, stereotypical hillbilly. Maybe mid-50s, with a patchy long beard, and what looked like even patchier hair under his trucker hat. He went on about some car talk I didn't understand, scratching his ass the whole time, before finally answering. Won't take long. I'm fast with my hands. I raised an eyebrow. Okay, but how long do you think exactly? I asked, somewhat annoyed. 10-ish hours? He said before spitting next to his boot. Ish. Alright, here. I said with a sigh before paying for my repair. Appreciate it. Enjoy Mammonville County, he said with a smirk, as he swiped the cash from my hands and stuffed it in his pocket, not even bothering to count it. I figured I'd try to find somewhere to eat, considering I had missed out on dinner, and breakfast would be rolling up soon enough, so I called my wife to explain the situation, ask if she needed anything, then left the shop. The town was basically in the middle of nowhere, but just barely. It was the type of tiny town you drive through all the time, but never stop at. I found a 24/7 diner that was actually pretty good. I definitely pigged out seriously though. 6 pancakes topped with ice cream, and a side of eggs and bacon for $6 is too good to pass up. Thanks to my rather large early breakfast, Along with a morning dessert, I managed to kill about 3 hours, along with maybe another hour of playing on my phone, before paying for my meal and leaving the diner. On my way back to the shop, I came across a rather strange building. It looked like a tiny 2-room shack, and was rather far from every other building in the town. I was gonna walk right past till I read the faded sign hanging on the window. Antiques and nostalgia for cheap. Huh, strange. Never heard of anyone selling nostalgia. I assumed it meant nostalgic items, and me and my wife are suckers for old collectibles from our childhood, so I decided I'd give it a look. I walked in expecting to see some tiny rundown thrift shop, but no. This building worked like a TARDIS. Bigger on the inside and much cleaner. My brain was having a system reboot just attempting to process what I was seeing. I tried to think of a logical, realistic explanation for it, but there wasn't one. The place was just larger on the inside. It looked never-ending, in fact. Just a void of blue honeycomb carpeting, Greek palace-like walls, and a single long aisle, with haunting angelic opera music playing throughout, as I tried taking in my surroundings. A man's voice brought me back to reality. Well, maybe that isn't the best word for it. "Welcome, sir. How are you tonight?" Unlike everyone else I've encountered in this town, his voice was dignified, proper. He spoke like the type of rich guy who feels obligated to talk classy. I looked to my left to see a pale man with a goatee and long slicked back hair, standing behind a seemingly never-ending desk, with only a single open book of names with dates of purchases, some looking to date back to the 1500s. The man was dressed like a bartender you'd see in an old western movie, wearing a red bow tie and black dress pants, a black suit vest with a white bottom up underneath, with the sleeves rolled up to the elbow. Huh? This? But what? How? I blubbered out in confusion, trying to ask where I was before getting cut off. "Where are you?" "An antique store, as the sign says. As you can see, I'm quite the collector. I needed a place able to hold all I have for sale, and this place worked perfectly. Please feel free to browse to your heart's content." He encouraged, explaining things so laid back. I did so, trying to ignore the whole infinity room thing. As I traveled down the single endless row of shelves, these were all items that would be better suited to be sold in an auction for millionaires. Rifles and flintlock pistols apparently used in the American Revolution. Samurai blades and masterfully crafted armor from the feudal period. Personal letters and journals of historical figures like Nikola Tesla, Lu Bu, and every president in history, from the US or any other country. What solidified this stuff's authenticity for me was the jewelry, you see. I've been a jeweler for over 10 years, specifically in the authenticity department, meaning it's my job to spot the difference between real and fake gems and ores. So if these things weren't real, they were the most well-made fakes I've ever come across. As the sign promised, it was all for cheap. Prices like $2, $3, $1. But next to each dollar sign there was another symbol, a Y with a lowercase e in the center of it. I figured it was just another form of currency from another country, but noted it was strange how there were no other symbols to any other countries aside from America and the unknown place. My greed got the best of me, grabbing over 10 things from the Stone and Iron Age for a whopping $13. However, during my shopping spree, I noticed there was nothing past the time of World War II. Certainly nothing from my younger years. The shopkeeper must have been able to read my mind, because the second that popped into my head, I heard his voice once more from right next to me. "Can I help you with anything, sir?" I jumped back, feeling my heart jump into my throat. I didn't even hear him coming up to me, like his footsteps were silent. Yeah, hi. You got anything more recent? like mid-80s to late 90s. The sign said nostalgia. All this is kind of old. I asked, trying to ignore the fact he just Houdini'd over to me. When I did, I could see a large, pearly white grin spread across his face, one that was a little too wide. Ah, you're looking for something more personal. That would be in the other room. This way, please, he said, extending his arm forward and standing aside. As we reached the front desk, I realized there was a door next to the entrance I completely missed on my way in. As we pressed the desk, he stopped and turned to me. Would you like to pay for these now, so you may leave them at the desk while we continue, or would you prefer to lug it around? He asked, pointing down to the pile of medieval and caveman relics in my arms. I shrugged and decided to do so, and he bagged them and left me on the desk for when I was ready to leave, insisting we end the deal with a handshake. Despite the fact our business wasn't over, before entering the back room, rather than any shelves, it was a single large podium, illuminated by a row of LED lights. So, where's the stuff? I asked, slightly worried he might have brought me back here to butcher me or something. He shook his head and clicked his tongue. No, not personal items. I can offer you something much better, he said as he flipped a switch, lowering down the podium to surface level. I can offer you the chance to relive some of your fondest memories, as if it were the first time. I raised my eyebrow and crossed my arms. And what do you mean by that? I asked. He flashed that large grin once more. I mean, even the most vivid dream couldn't compare to the feeling of nostalgia I can grant you. I can bring you to the very source of that nostalgia. Just step on the podium, think of the memory you'd like to enter, and close your eyes, he said with great charisma. I looked back and forth between him and the podium before shrugging. Alright, why not? I said. Splendid. He then guided me to the podium, instructed me once more before shaking my hand once more and telling me to have fun. I did so, closing my eyes, opening them to see myself in the mirror. 17 years ago in college. I knew exactly the day, too, seeing I was wearing the goofy Reese's shirt and baggy sweatpants, along with my roommate playing Ocarina of Time on our shitty little TV, asking me if I was ready for Benny's party. The very party I met my wife. It was the strangest feeling. I don't even really know how to describe it. I knew I was in the past, but at the same time had absolutely no clue I was reliving my life. I both could and couldn't speak and move freely, as trying to say anything about the future would make me forgetful and quickly moving on from the topic. It was as he said, better than any vivid dream you could imagine. The night was as perfect as I remember, from the enjoyment of reliving a crazy party from my younger years, but more importantly, the feeling of meeting Stephanie for the first time. I remember going mush-brained on sight, getting trashed enough to try and talk to her, getting her old phone number I've almost forgotten, down to the end of the night, ending with how any truly romantic college love story normally starts. A drunk one-night stand, and waking up realizing we'd like doing more than hooking up at frat parties. Not long after she left my dorm the next morning, I woke up, back into the empty room with the suited man. Well, did you enjoy yourself? He asked with a confident smirk. It took me a few moments to remember I had just purchased temporary time travel, and it was crazy. Holy shit, that was something else, man. How much was it? I asked to fish out my wallet from the pocket. He waved his hand in the air with a cheeky grin. Not necessary. You've already paid in full, he said as he raised the podium with the number 15, and that strange Y symbol labeled on the price tags. Unlike the price tags, there was no regular dollar sign next to it. I scratched and looked at him. What does this Y thing mean anyway? I asked, tapping the metal plates it was engraved on. His response made me freeze from fear. His grin grew much wider. Years, Mr. Talbert, he announced. I stared at him for a while in shock. How do you know my name? I asked. I could hear the shakiness in my voice as I asked it. Why, I know everything about Ryan. I know you were born on November 4th, 1986. I know you almost died of hypothermia when you were 8 trying to catch Santa on Christmas. I know you have twins, Samuel and Samantha. Lovely children, by the way. Need I go on? He said as he crossed his arms. I tried to register the fact that this man I've never seen before in my life knew everything about me. I was so lost about it I almost completely forgot the first part of his answer. What did you mean years? I asked cautiously. He threw his head back with a laugh. Is it not obvious? You've paid to relive one of your fondest memories in your past, in exchange for possible memories in the future. He explained matter-of-factly. Does. I tried to mumble out of my somewhat nerve-induced paralyzed mouth before he answered the questions for me before I could finish asking. Yes, Ryan. You've just given me 15 years of your life. Of course, that's not including the previously spent 13, so that would be 28 years of your life. He said with a sting in his voice, like a lone shark who swindled his biggest debt-racked schmuck. But I gave you money for those things out there. I yelled out, almost in plea after hearing my remaining lifespan had been shortened by at least a quarter. If I'm lucky. He clicked his tongue again and flashed that same cheeky grin. You can think of that as a donation of sorts. After all, you'll most likely sell at least one of those items for a large sum of money. Surely you won't mind $13. I could feel my rage boil, melting over my frozen paralysis, charging the man ready to beat the shit out of him. You tricked me. I yelled, swinging my fist toward his face, only to land straight onto mine as my knuckles connected with empty air. Tricked you? I heard him say from my left. His voice was different, though. It was deeper than anything a human can make. I slowly turned to see a set of crouched goat-like legs, with shiny gold-plated hooves. I slowly looked up to see a half-goat, half-goblin-like creature with crimson-red skin, a wolf-like snout filled with gold and even diamond teeth, and yet what seemed to glow silver. He wore an excessive amount of the finest jewelry, along with a large platinum crown. You came into this store on your own accord, did you not? He hissed, grabbing the hair from the back of my head and pulling it upwards to meet him face to face, his bright silver eyes staring right through me. You had plenty of opportunity to ask what that simple symbol could mean. Did you ask the price for reliving your memory? No, you let your greed guide you, and you've paid the price for it. Now please take your items and leave, or shop some more if you'd like. He mocked. Just remember, we don't forget to shake on it when we're done. He finished with another laugh before dropping my head back to the ground. My body felt like it was made of stone, causing me to smack it rather hard, putting me in a heavy daze. I dared not argue with whatever he was, but could only ask one question. Are you the devil? I was horrified at the beast I was seeing. He cackled and slapped his knee. If I had a nickel for every time I've heard that one, thinking about it, I probably do. No, the old man was no such need for a thing. I mean, neither do I, but there's something just so fascinating, not to mention hilarious about messing with your human minds. Now, would you like to see this chit-chat going? He started as he tapped a solid gold watch wrapped around his wrist. I couldn't even say anything, just stare in shock and awe. After a minute, he sighed. All right, then. He muttered before snapping his fingers. Suddenly, I was waking up in my car completely repaired outside the shop. Not even an hour after originally entering. I tried to convince myself it was a dream, till I looked to my passenger seat to see my bag of recently purchased goods. I didn't know how to react, so I simply drove home in complete silence, just running loops in my head about what had just happened. When I got home, I was greeted by my family. The kids asked to play while Stephanie welcomed me home as she got ready for work. I tried my best to keep my composure, but seeing the ones I love most, right after being told my life has been shortened, cut me deeply. Well, I'm sure they saw it on my face, as the kids gave me confused looks while my wife asked me if everything was okay. I simply told her it was just a long night, and I was just happy to be home. As he said, I sold most of the items purchased, a lot of the cash being put aside for Sam and Sam once I pass. It's been about 14 years since then. Yesterday morning I got a call from the hospital telling me they had my test results. After a rather violent asthma attack a few weeks prior, they said it's lung cancer, untreatable. I've been given an estimate of 3 years left at best. I'm thinking of taking one more trip to Mammonville, even if only to see the place still stands, and if it does, well, I've already been given my death date. What's another year or two? Get them one last gift. Okay, look. Opening my eyes, I saw the beautiful diamond necklace my husband had got me for my birthday. Baby, I love it. Pulling my hair up, he placed the beautiful and expensive necklace on me. I loved how it shined in the light. Nothing is too good for my princess. After giving me a kiss, he headed for the shower. Matt had been pulling so many late nights. He always had a reason why his location or his phone was off. I thought he was cheating again, but after receiving my present, I knew he was doing it for me. After 5 years of marriage, you always think they'll find something better. Being the CEO of a major electronics company gave him a lot of leeway, such as always getting VIP service, never having to wait in line, and hundreds of beautiful women begging for a chance. But he always picked me. Well, at least he always came home to me. I knew what was going on the first time it happened. Subtle things at first. A perfume that wasn't mine, lipstick marks on him, never letting me see his phone, sneaking out when he thought I was asleep. Every time I brought it up, he gave me a lesson. I loved him, I truly did. He was always so sweet, and he truly didn't hurt me. He broke my arm one time, but he cared for me, and once I was better, he bought me a new beach house. With Matt, I didn't have to work. It gave me time to ensure all of the chores were done, but things began to change after I found out I was pregnant 6 months ago. He was a whole new man. I noticed he was home more. He even took the lock off his phone. He catered to me and hired a maid, ensuring I could rest and paint. It felt as if we had just entered the honeymoon phase again. I loved painting, but lately I had less and less time to do any. The baby was taking up a lot of my time, and I couldn't be happier. Being a mom was always a dream of mine. I couldn't wait to hold our baby. Ever since I found out I was pregnant, Matt began doing more overseas trips. He didn't want me flying while pregnant. But each time he would bring back a beautiful piece of jewelry. Even with the ability to buy anything I wanted, getting presents from Matt was way more special. I was on FaceTime with my sister Maddie. My attention was more on the show I was watching, until she said something that brought my attention back to the screen. "Lauren, are you bleeding?" "What? Where?" "On your neck. I saw it when your necklace shifted." Let me go look in the mirror." After placing my phone on the counter, I looked into the bathroom mirror. There was a smear of blood. After grabbing a paper towel and wiping the area, I saw there was no cut or any spot where it could have come from. I think the necklace might have just nicked me. Well, those are real diamonds, so they might be sharp. But anyways, Lauren, do you think that... I don't know why, but I felt eyes on me. Looking around the bathroom, I was alone. After moving back to my spot on the couch, I continued my conversation with Maddie before falling asleep. I woke up to something shaking me. Opening my eyes, I saw a woman. She was pale and looked as if her skin had melted off. She had black holes for eyes and a broken jaw that hung, showing exposed bones. Her stomach was cut open and she held her intestines. It seemed as if she was trying to speak, but I was terrified. Screaming, I jumped up. "Lauren, what is it?" Matt asked after rushing to my side. "There was a woman. She was just..." "What?" "Come here, baby. It was just a dream." He pulled me to his chest, and after some calm breaths, I felt better. After a delicious dinner from our new in-home chef, I felt like I wanted to paint. As I started to create a colorful background, I saw movement in the corner of my eye. Turning my head, I realized it was my reflection in the window, but something about it looked off. I looked at the window for a few seconds before turning back to my painting. But what I saw on my canvas caused me to drop my paints. "In the canvas somehow, help me," was written in the paint. The only problem is, it was written with a finger, not a paintbrush. I felt my stomach do a flip and knew what was coming. Running to the bathroom, I threw up the meal I had only eaten hours ago. "She's giving you trouble tonight, isn't she?" I looked up to see Matt in the doorway holding my nausea medication and a Sprite. "Thank you. Let me wash my mouth out and I'll be ready for my medicine." As I stood in the mirror swishing the mouthwash, I realized the skin around my neck was red. Had the diamonds given me a rash? "Lauren, hurry up. Our show's about to come on." I quickly washed my mouth out before heading into the living room. It felt nice cuddling with Matt on the couch. I'm not sure when, but I fell asleep, waking up to a sweet smell. Opening my eyes, I realized I was in bed. Looking to my left, I saw Matt holding a breakfast spread with various fresh fruits. "I have to leave for a few days on a work trip. Will you be okay?" "I think so, but I'll ask Maddie to stay over with me. That way you don't have to worry." "That's a good idea. I'll see you in 4 days." He gave me a passionate kiss, which turned into us taking some quality time in bed together. Once we were done, he gave me a goofy grin. "Why are you looking at me like that?" "I'm just happy you're mine." After moving on the edge of the bed, he began to get dressed. "Now I really have to go." Kissing my head, he began to pack. After loading everything into the car, he turned to hug me. "Let me finish making breakfast. I want you full before the trip." "I have to go," he said while grabbing a banana from the fruit basket. "I love you," he said while heading out the door. "Love you too," I said while the door slammed shut. After I had finished breakfast, I called Maddie. "Hey, want to come stay for a few days?" "This is sudden. Are you okay?" "I am. Matt is going on a business trip and I don't want to be alone." "I'll be there around 5. I have to get back to work. Love you." "I love you too." And once again, I was alone with my thoughts. After spending a few hours watching TV, I decided to get out for some fresh air, choosing to visit my favorite coffee shop a few blocks away. After getting dressed, I realized Matt had packed my backpack in the closet. Being 5'4" meant I would have to get something to stand on in order to reach the shelf. After pulling a stepladder out of the hallway closet, I was able to climb up. I saw my backpack hidden under some other items and pulled it out. Why is this heavy? Looking into the bag, I saw a pair of heels. Pulling them out, I realized they were the Prada shoes I had been hinting at for weeks. I pulled them out and was mesmerized. Wait, 8.5? I wear a size 7. And they look as if they had already been worn. The bottoms had mud on them. Is that blood? That didn't make sense. Matt was doing better. Falling to the ground in tears, I knew he was cheating on me again. "Lauren, you need to leave him." Maddie had just arrived and found me on the couch, still a mess. "But the baby, she needs her father." "You have an amazing support system. Even without a father, she will be a great kid, just like her mother was." "I have no income, no house, and no car. Everything I have now is in Matt's name. He won't let me go." Don't you see, Lauren? That's what he wanted. He has full control over you. You're his fifth wife. He just has a hard time finding someone that isn't with him for his money. You can't keep defending him. Don't you think it's odd what happened to his other wives? Thinking about them now gave me chills. Let's see, before you there was Haley, which, might I remind you, she's still missing. And then there was Becca. She just turned 18 when they got married, but I know he was seeing her before that. And how old is Matt? Yeah, he's turning 40 this year, and they got married when he was 31. They never did find her torso. Maddie, stop. I don't want to hear about that. Lauren, this is important. I want to make sure you're safe. I love Matt. We have had rough patches, but every couple does. Every couple doesn't have problems resulting in broken bones and bruises. When he threw you down the stairs, I had to physically restrain Dad. He wanted to give him the same treatment. I miss him. 2 days after my release from the hospital, our father was killed in an accident. The police told us he must have been tired and fell asleep, causing his car to go off into the ditch. By the time they got him out, he was unrecognizable. The burns covered 99% of his body. He was barely alive, and by the time we got to the hospital, we knew he wasn't going to make it through the night. But I did find it odd that Matt had basically forced me to get my dad's car the night before the accident. He said he wanted to test out the car for safety, ensuring our baby won't get hurt in the back seat if there was a wreck. Let's talk about something else. How about we decide what we want for dinner? That sounds great. I'm going to take a shower. As I headed for the bathroom, I couldn't help but think about his other two wives, Ariel and Rain. Ariel had been his first wife. Just like the mermaid, she had the vibrant red hair. She was a model and loved the attention. Matt told me they got divorced because she had been sleeping around and ran off with a guy, but she hadn't been active on any social media since before the divorce. And Rain, the French actress, she was easily the prettiest of his wives. She had the sweetest smile. I think he still sees her. I saw her name pop up on his phone before he could grab it. When I asked him about it, he turned it on me and stormed out. He came back a few days later smelling of alcohol and proudly showing off the hickeys that covered his body. Has my love blinded me? Maddie had me thinking, but I can't leave him. Not now. Once the baby is here, I can try to find a way out, but he makes me happy. I was so lost in my thoughts, I almost missed it. My necklace had shifted slightly and I noticed my skin had turned a grayish color. It looked as if the skin was dead and beginning to decay. I tried to take the necklace off, but it seemed as if it was broken or stuck. Panicking, I rushed out of the bathroom. Oh, hey, dinner should be here in 30. She paused, taking in my worried expression. Lauren, what's wrong? Are you doing okay? Look at my skin. She got up, and after inspecting my neck, I could tell she was worried too. Come on, we're going to the ER. After throwing on a jacket and getting my shoes, we were out the door and on the way to the hospital. The next few hours flew by. The doctor had to cut the necklace off. I am deathly allergic to cubic zirconia, and it was killing me from the inside out. That's how I found out the diamonds weren't real. If I had kept it on, he said I would have eventually been weakened to a near-death state. Because of the baby, they decided to keep me overnight, but it wasn't until the news came on that I felt true fear. Matt never let us get cable, and because I didn't want to be stressed, I refrained from reading or watching any type of news. This was more a suggestion from Matt and not my own choice, but the hospital only had a few basic channels. I was on my phone reading while Maddie got us dinner, and the news came on. Feeling a headache coming on, I put my phone down and watched the TV, but the headline was what caught my attention. Monster on the loose in Parkdale. I felt chills whenever it's where you live. Things are much scarier. I grabbed the remote, turning up the volume just as the anchor began to talk. Tonight, I stand in front of Richardson Park. It has only been an hour since a call was made to the police. A young couple had gone out for a hike, but after both of their phones died, they got lost. Venturing into a part that is far off the usual hiking trail, they made a grisly discovery. There they stumbled into the shallow grave of a missing New York woman. New York? It's quite a ways away. What is a New York woman doing in Texas? Here is a picture of the young woman. Her name is Marcy Bitters, and she was last seen going home with a well-dressed man. Frozen in shock, I couldn't believe my eyes. There on the screen was my necklace. On the neck of a now-dead woman sat the diamonds that were gifted to me. But the realization that it was the woman who I had been seeing broke me. So many thoughts crossed my mind, and I decided I would post this here. He doesn't know that I told anyone. I'm fearful of what he'll do. But my phone just dinged, and it was a text from Matt. Hey honey, just checking in. I had a great idea. Why don't we take a long weekend and go camp at Richardson Park? I would love some alone time with you. Matt, what did you do? People say when something bad is about to happen to you, you can feel it, that you'll experience some sense of doom on the horizon. But when I awoke alone in bed that morning, I experienced nothing like that. Everything my eyes opened to was utterly and entirely ordinary. My girlfriend had already left for work, as she always had. So, as usual, I dragged myself out of bed to ready myself for yet another dull weekday at my dead-end job. When I tell you nothing seemed abnormal in my small, crumbling suburban house, I mean it. My coffee tasted like crap, as it typically did when I was in a rush, and forgot to add creamer to it. The freezing water stung my skin like ice in the shower, just like every other morning. Even the large, deep crack that caused me to wrestle with the knob just to get out the front door was normal. All within my home was painfully, frustratingly average. Even after locking my door and walking down my driveway that morning, all seemed in its usual place. The first sign of anything being wrong wasn't until I was greeted by my elderly neighbor as he headed back up his own driveway after collecting his morning paper. "Morning, neighbor," he said cheerfully. He was a nice enough guy, so it wasn't strange for him to wave and say good morning. But there was just the slightest hint of extra emotion in the way he delivered his greeting that caused me to actually look at him, rather than absent-mindedly wave in his direction like I usually did. The man's smile was oddly large, though not quite inhumanly so, yet his lips stretched wider than I'd ever seen them before. It almost appeared as though they were just a little too big for his face, as the skin around them seemed to stretch up to the point just before it would tear and bleed. Good morning." I started out nervously as I opened my car door. "Why the long face, neighbor? You should always be smiling. After all, it's a beautiful day, isn't it?" he asked. With each sentence, the words seemed to carry more excitement. I was obviously a little creeped out, but I tried to keep a polite composure as I responded. Yeah, you're right. It sure is a beautiful day." I returned his disturbing, distorted facial expression with a smile of my own. The red slits on the bottom of his face parted a little, and he nodded seemingly in approval and continued up to his house as I entered my car. The whole exchange rattled me a little, but if I'm being honest, I was able to shake off the feeling after just a moment or so when I realized I couldn't afford to be late to work again. So, with my attention back on getting to work, I pulled out of my driveway and began what I'd soon realize would be the most disturbing drive of my life. In the past, driving to work had always been a relatively mundane task. I'd never realized how much people watching I actually do during this time of the day. The amount of people walking their dogs through the neighborhood or on early morning jogs. How many times I just happened to look at the driver sitting in the lane next to me as we both awaited the red light to turn green. Or even how many eyes locked with my own and the driver's, heading in the opposite direction as me. But in all the times I had previously taken this drive, I'd probably only noticed a smile on anyone's face a few times. It isn't normal for people to just happen to be smiling when you look at them. It's more often a blank, nearly emotionless expression. But on that day, every single individual I looked at was smiling. Every last one of them. They weren't just standard smiles like the polite one I gave my neighbor that morning either. They were grotesque smiles. Mouths stretched far too wide, and eyelids far too open. Moreover, it seemed that with each face I looked at, the expression became more and more exaggerated. My neighbor's smile was unnerving, but to see so many people with their lips spanning wildly was well beyond a little unsettling. It was disgusting. I know how that must sound, but I cannot properly describe the absolute sense of dread that had fully gripped me as I drove, probably faster than I should have. The faces of every human being twisted and distorted so much that I'm not sure what surprised me more, how impossibly wide their lips were smeared, or how astounding it was that despite the obvious strain it had to have been putting on their bodies, there was no sign whatsoever that any muscle or tissue had been damaged even slightly. When I finally arrived at work and those horrid smiles were behind me, I was trembling. My hands still gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles while I sat and tried to gather myself. What the hell was going on? I took several deep breaths and counted to 10 to calm my nerves. I reasoned with myself that my neighbor's odd demeanor had set me off, and I'd only imagined all those disturbed and jagged grins on my drive. Regardless, I still had to work, so after a moment more of breathing exercises, I left the sanctity of my vehicle and went inside. Immediately upon entering, I heard a sharp, "Hello, how was your weekend?" in a warped tone that reminded me all too much of the encounter with my neighbor earlier that morning. I looked up to see the receptionist of my office gazing hungrily at me, her lips spread almost literally from ear to ear. My heart pounded in my chest as the fear I'd only moments before let go of returned with twice its former presence. As I looked at her in horror, I noticed her eyelids, too, were spread grotesquely wide, causing her eyes to bulge out between the slits odiously, like bubbles on the precipice of popping. I stumbled, stepping back into the door, and pressed my back into it like cornered prey. "What?" I stammered out. "What's wrong with everyone?" She tilted her head, giving the impression that she was confused, but her horrifying expression remained constant. "What was that? You know I can't understand you when you mumble. And why on earth aren't you smiling on such a beautiful day?" Her words washed over me like sleet as their familiarity gnawed at my sanity. I have to get to work," I said shakily and quickly walked past her, my body practically pinned to the furthest wall from her as possible. I didn't dare to look at the faces of any of my other co-workers as I hastily made my way to my cubicle. I sat and gritted my teeth, trying desperately to force the panic that was quickly rising in my chest back down. As long as I was in my cubicle, no one ought to bother me. I'll just get my work done and try to leave a little early today, thought to myself. For a while, this worked. I focused on my normal duties and was able to keep those awful smiling faces out of my mind for a few hours. I was just finishing up a report when another coworker approached me. "Well, howdy there, buddy. How are you today?" The voice cut through the air like a fork scraping rotten food off a plate and into the garbage. I grinded my teeth as stress worked its fingers around my lungs again and squeezed. I remained facing away from the horrid sight I knew would greet me if I dared turn around, and instead I simply kept my back to my coworker and responded through a dry throat. "Hey man, I'm good. but got a lot of work to do. I'll chat with you tomorrow, okay? He didn't seem to take the hint and continued talking to me with that same disgustingly happy tone I'd now heard 3 times that day, as he went on about his weekend highlights. My slowly breaking mind only registered the words, new video game and barbecue. After a few moments I could take no more of his abhorrent voice grinding away at my eardrums like sandpaper, and I interrupted him with, "That sounds great, man, but like I said, I've got a lot to do today, so we'll chat later, okay?" He ceased talking suddenly in response. I thought the silence would bring me relief, but dread overtook me as the quiet hung in the air like a thick, putrid stench. It was quiet for so long I thought I'd perhaps offended him and he'd left. But the jarring sound of his exaggerated, cheerful speech broke the silence with the words I'd now grown to despise more than any slur or insult I could imagine. "Okay, bud, no worries, but you seem kind of out of it. You should smile more on such a beautiful day like this." I clenched my fists as my foot began to tap wildly on the floor below my desk, and I simply nodded as I grinded my teeth with dangerous pressure. I heard his footsteps echo through the building as they got farther and farther from me. At that point, my sense of reality was held together by thin strings, but I kept telling myself all I had to do was get through a few more hours of work, and I could go home to my girlfriend and put this unsettling day behind me. Sadly, I was quickly proven wrong when only a few minutes later, my office phone began to ring. I dreaded what I might hear on the other end and let it ring for a moment. I debated on just ignoring it entirely until I saw the caller ID was from my boss's office. So I reluctantly plucked my phone from its dock and answered, "Yes, ma'am. What can I do for you?" I managed to get out the words with only an ounce of shakiness in my voice. "I need you to come to my office immediately. I've got some concerns I want to address with you." The tone of her voice sounded upbeat, but not freakishly so like my other coworkers. "Yes, ma'am. I'm on my way." I hung up and took another deep breath to prepare myself. I was both irritated about the lecture I thought was coming, and looking forward to it. My boss was a good person, but she was also the no bullshit kind. She was known for being stern with employees, and I myself experienced her anger on a few occasions, but today, after everything, I found myself almost hopeful to receive an irate lecture from her. I made my way through the building, being sure to ignore any overly excited greetings from coworkers as I swiftly walked through the maze of cubicles. I arrive at the open door to my boss's office to find her standing with her back to me, gazing at something out the window as if in deep thought. "Sit down, please," she said. I did as instructed. "What's this all about, boss?" I asked, genuinely curious. "You know what it takes for a clock to work properly, don't you?" She asked sarcastically. I sighed with relief at the normalcy of her demeanor, but still rolled my eyes and readied myself for the classic cogs in the clock metaphor. "Yes, ma'am. All the cogs must work together or the gears won't turn," I said. "Right." She responded with more excitement than I was comfortable with. "If even one cog isn't spinning, all the efforts of the others are wasted energy." She continued. "I don't understand. Am I late on a report? Was there a deadline I missed?" I asked, my concern real. "No, nothing like that," she said, keeping her back turned to me as she took a step closer to the window. "It's just that a couple of your coworkers informed me that you aren't acting like a team player today." I thought back to my coworkers and their horrible smiling faces. Gulping vomit back down into my heavy stomach as I noticed the inflection of her words heightening. "But don't worry. I know how you can be a team player," she offered. I strained my eyes in an attempt to make out the wry image of her reflected face in the glass, but to no avail. Then, in an automated response, I asked the most idiotic question I've ever asked in my life. "How?" At last she turned to face me, and a choked gasp clawed its way out of my throat reflexively as I stared back at the thing that eyed me barbarically from across the room, like a small rabbit in the blinding headlights of a car. Her lips tore across the rubber-like substance of her face that was not skin, and parted hideously, revealing a mouth filled with too many white bones to be human teeth, and the fat, bulbous things that sat where her eyes should have bulged out like bubbling tumors from their sockets, and gloated down at me vigorously. The way the thing's not facial muscles contorted and stretched as it spoke shouldn't have been able to form syllables. Yet, from them came the same appalling statement that every face had echoed throughout the day. "Smile," it said. "After all, it's a beautiful day." The last threads of my psyche snapped and I screamed. Blood welted the corners of my lips as they expanded well beyond their normal limits. Tears flowed down my face from both pain and fear as I ran from the room and out of the building. I'd left my car keys on my desk, but I didn't turn back for them. Instead, I just ran down the sidewalk, trying in vain not to look at the monstrous, smiling faces which surrounded me. I heard cheerful voice after horribly cheerful voice tell me what a beautiful day it was and to smile. I covered my ears as I ran through the thickening crowds as they began to engulf the walkway. I ran into the middle of the street in a frantic attempt to avoid them. My lungs burned and my legs ached as I sprinted well beyond what I would have previously thought possible. But the voices kept coming. "Smile, smile, buddy. It's a beautiful day." "Shut the hell up," I shouted back through wheezing breaths. The bodies began to pour out of the entrance to seemingly every building and the driver's side from seemingly every car. Their numbers climbed to absurd digits until I was engulfed in a sea of revolting smiles. It was like the entire city had conjoined on a single block. Still, I continued to run. The choir of voices deafening, overlapping demands no longer sounded human, but I knew what they said all the same. I pushed through them, not caring how young or old, nor who or what I might be injuring. Finally, I pushed out of the ocean of monsters and saw a clear road ahead. Despite the agony my body was in, I forced my numbing legs and wheezing lungs forward toward the clearing in the street. As I tried desperately to distance myself from them, I made the horrible mistake of looking back at the flood of nightmares that followed not far behind me. Their faces. God, their faces. The abominable images of swollen mouths and cancerous eyes seared permanently in my mind is the last thing I saw before I felt an incredible force slam hard into me and the world went black. I jolted awake to find myself in a dark hospital room. "Whoa, whoa, it's okay. You're okay now," I heard a familiar voice say. It was my girlfriend. It was too dark to make out her details, but her silhouette still brought me comfort, and I eased back into the bed I found myself lying in. "You're in the hospital. You were in an accident," she explained. I took a moment to think, the events of what led to my being there not quite clear in my mind. "I got hit by a car," I asked as the memories began to return. "Yes, the doctor said you were super lucky though. Just a broken leg, some broken ribs, and mild bruising. But he said you're going to be fine." A wave of relief washed over me as she took my hand and squeezed it gently. The doctor said it's going to be a long recovery, but he did recommend something that he said will make it go much faster. A pervasive chill inched its way up my spine as I listened to her voice more closely and heard a recognizable inflection. "What?" I asked, dreading the answer, but not yet entirely certain why. She leaned forward, putting her face closer to mine and allowing for just a hint of its features to become illuminated by the quickening beep of the heart monitor and said, "Smile." Don't get me wrong. I took the job in the first place primarily because, well, I love kids. Difficult as they can be sometimes, they're sweet and adorable, and I think I get along with them very well. The second reason was definitely the surprisingly good pay, though. I can't deny that wasn't a factor. Money is a human motivator. I've worked at Gold Garden Daycare for almost a year now. It's not a hard job at all. I just need to make sure I keep an eye on all the kids and keep them entertained. A lot of them are good kids, if a little messy, but something happened that, like I said, has made me want to quit, if I can even afford to. Last week I came in first in the morning. I didn't have the keys, so I just sat down on the bench outside, browsing through my phone while I waited for the owner to show up. She was a sweet old lady with a lot of grandkids. Though she usually came in before me, I wasn't worried. It was an early morning. While I was waiting, an unfamiliar fancy car pulled into the parking lot. A tall woman got out. The woman was, honestly, one of the most beautiful women I've ever seen. She was slim with her platinum blonde hair cascading in waves down her shoulders. She wore a red blazer and pencil skirt with gold trim, the buttons reflecting the streetlights that had yet to turn off for the morning. She smiled at me and approached the bench where I was sitting. I could make out her face in more detail now, seeing the beauty mark in the corner of her eye and the minimal makeup that dusted her cheeks. I felt a little small next to her. I was never especially insecure about my looks, but she was just so stunning that I felt ugly in comparison. "Good morning," she chirped, smiling again. "Is the daycare open?" I almost choked on my words as I responded. "It'll be open as soon as the owner gets here." "That's good to hear. I have work. Would you mind keeping an eye on my son until the place opens up? I'll arrange everything properly when I come back to pick him up. Payment and all that." I hesitated. Part of me was yelling that I couldn't be letting someone's kid stay if they hadn't paid, but another part didn't want to refuse a customer. I'm sure the owner won't mind, right? "That's fine," I told her finally. The woman smiled kindly and turned back to her car. "Doyle, come here. Meet the nice new daycare lady." I fidgeted as a kid climbed out of the car, shutting the door and walking up slowly. He had blonde hair like his mother, but it was curly and short. He wouldn't look me in the eye. His mother put her hand on his shoulder and smiled at me yet again. "This is Doyle. He's 3. I hope that's okay." "It is, don't worry," I reassured the woman. She patted her son on the head. "I'm glad. I've got to be going, but thank you very much. I'll be back this afternoon to make arrangements, okay?" "Sounds good." The woman crouched down next to her son. "Be good for the daycare people, okay? Mama will be back this afternoon." Doyle could barely look at his mother either, but he nodded, and the woman strode back to her car before driving off. I turned my attention to Doyle. He sat down on the bench, looking down at his hands and not saying a word to me. "I'm Miss Kaylee. Nice to meet you, Doyle," I said to him, trying to be friendly. Doyle didn't say a word in response. Trepidation crept up my spine, but I sat next to him on the bench. "Have you ever been to a daycare before?" Still nothing. He didn't look at me, or even make a single noise. I decided I should wait for the owner to get here and open up before I talked to him again. Thankfully, I didn't have to sit in silence for long. The owner's silver old car arrived in the parking lot. The gentle old woman hobbled out of the car, clutching her purse and taking out the keys. I got up and hurried over to her car to help her. "Mrs. Garcia, here, I'll unlock the building. I hope it's okay, but I let a woman leave her son here. She said she'd make the arrangements when she came back to pick him up." I explained as I took the keys. I didn't realize until I was done that I hadn't let her get a word out. Mrs. Garcia smiled up at me regardless. "That's fine, dear. Thank you for opening up." I was overcome with a wash of relief as I went up to the front doors to unlock them. Doyle got up behind me and waddled inside, sitting down in a beanbag chair and still refusing to look at me. other than Doyle just sitting there a little creepily. Opening went smoothly, and other parents with their children started arriving along with the other attendants. Everything was normal until Doyle walked up to me. "Miss Daycare Lady?" he asked. His voice was weirdly scratchy for a 3-year-old. He sounded eerily like he'd been breathing in smoke. I crouched down in front of him, smiling. "I'm Miss Kaylee. How can I help you? Are you hungry?" Doyle nodded, still refusing to look me in the eye. I got up and retrieved some crackers and applesauce for him. When I came back, Doyle was gone. Confused, I looked around, trying to spot the curly blonde boy among the other kids, but I couldn't find him. I started to get a little worried that he ran out the door or something. Then I heard something behind me. I turned around and saw Doyle standing on a table, staring directly at me. I blinked. Doyle was on the floor again, right in front of me, back to not looking right at me. He reached up, his short arms unable to reach the crackers and applesauce in my hands. Shaking my head, I handed him the snacks, trying to make sense of what I just saw. Doyle plopped down at one of the chairs and started eating. I decided I had to have just been seeing things. Maybe I had gotten up too early, and I was sleep deprived. If that really happened, someone else would have seen it. I should take tomorrow off if it happens again. And it did. Doyle approached me again with his trash and held it up to me. As soon as I took it, he lifted his head slightly and spoke. "I'm still hungry." His scratchy voice grew horribly deep with those 3 words. I looked around at the other kids and attendants. Everyone else was playing with each other or reading. No one seemed to have heard that. So, once again, I decided I was just tired. I was definitely going to be taking tomorrow off, though. "You'll have to wait until lunch. Sorry, Doyle." I told him politely, taking his trash. I could barely see his face through his thick mop of hair, but I could tell he was frowning. "But I'm hungry now," he said. His voice was normal again. At least it was no longer as deep as an adult man's. I mentally prepared myself to need to bargain with the kid. It wasn't an uncommon occurrence, something like this. One of the children getting upset that they couldn't eat yet. "I know. I'm so sorry. Lunch is just in about an hour, so don't worry. We've got lots of things you can do in the meantime." I gestured broadly to the rest of the playroom. Doyle only frowned at me again. "I'm hungry." "I'm sorry that you are, but hopefully those snacks will tide you over until lunch." Doyle didn't say anything for a while. I wasn't sure what to do until he lifted his head, his hair finally falling out of his eyes. They were such an odd shade of brown I could have mistaken them for red. "Miss Kaylee?" "Yes?" "I'm hungry now." I just smiled at him tiredly and opened my mouth to explain he would have to wait again. Before I could get a word out, though, he bit me. Little teeth sunk into my arm, just further from my hand than my wrist. I couldn't help but cry out in pain. It hurt. I'd been nibbled on by kids before, but this hurt much, much worse. I squeezed my eyes shut and clutched where he had attempted to ravage my arm, immediately feeling blood spilling from my flesh into my hand. I peeked at it to see the wound already beginning to turn purple. Doyle just stood there looking at me as if he'd done nothing, like he was watching me pretend to be in pain. "Kaylee!" One of my coworkers rushed over, grabbing my arm and seeing why I was making such a fuss. Oh no. Human bites can get infected bad. I'll take you to the hospital." "I'll just treat it myself." I started to tell her weakly, but the pain was just too much. Tears began to fill from my eyes, dripping down my cheeks. As soon as they started welling up, Doyle began hissing at me loudly. My coworker grabbed me and pulled me away from Doyle, who was now practically snarling. I sniffed, still crying salty tears. Another dribbled down my arm and hit the carpeted floor, making Doyle back away from me and hiss again. He waved his arms wildly as if trying to scratch me. Not that he did. He had backed out of range. The bite mark on my arm was only throbbing with more and more pain by the second. The purplish bruise and redness were starting to spread as I was rushed to the car and soon to the hospital. I could do nothing but watch the pain shoot through my arm. Color spreading, blood dripping, bite marks seeming to grow deeper and darker the longer I stared at it. We had reached the hospital in good time, but the waiting game was killing me. The pain was completely unbearable. The bruising was covering almost my entire arm at that point, and the bite marks were so deep it felt like as if he had bitten right through the whole thing. My veins pulsed and seemed to shriek in pain right alongside every other molecule in my arm. Finally, I was brought to a doctor. The man in his lab coat took one glance at my arm and announced I needed surgery immediately. I don't remember much between that and when I woke up afterward. I was drugged very quickly, put on so many painkillers. It felt like even my brain had gone numb, and when I opened my eyes again, I still had a hard time moving. The same doctor joined me in the hospital room not long after I awoke. He smiled at me from where he stood at the foot of the bed. "Don't worry, I understand. It happens to the best of us." Unsure what he was talking about, I just blinked a few times. The doctor's gaze shifted down at my injured arm, which I still couldn't feel. I mustered up the energy to turn my head and look at the wound. But the painkillers weren't the reason I had no sensation in my arm. That was because it was gone. I could do little more than make a noise of shock. The doctor just shook his head. "So sorry about the hospital bills, but I'll be paying for your prosthetic personally." I managed to turn my head back to face him directly. The doctor smiled and pulled up his sleeve, revealing a prosthetic arm of his own. "That child is serious trouble." I write this now because my roommate has only just found the time to bring in my phone and laptop. As soon as I'm done typing this, I'm going to put in my 2 weeks digitally, and then take those 2 weeks off because I'm still in the hospital. I don't blame the owner, and I do feel a little guilty that I'll be quitting on her, but there's no chance in hell I'm going back to that place when that kid could still be there. Marcy's is one of those retro-style diners that's either luringly nostalgic or luridly garish, depending on personal taste. The interior is a sickly sweet concoction of bubblegum, faux leather, seating, and spearmint tiles. You don't need to stretch your imagination to picture the decorative touches. Think classic cars, think Star-Spangled Banner. A jukebox plays a selection of rock and roll, surf rock, and doo-wop classics. The records are purely aesthetic. It's 100% digital and connected to Spotify. The Art Deco exterior is trimmed with orange tube lighting and chrome. The name Marcy's, shaped from neon lights of course, proudly dominates the roof in sci-fi green. To finish off the look, at the rear of the diner sits an immaculate 1970s Airstream that Marcy's calls home. Whether it makes you grin or makes you puke, it is a quintessential slice of Americana that gives our otherwise plain and quiet town some much-needed character. Personally, I consider it my second home. I'm Andy, by the way. Enough about the setting, on to my experience. This is something that happened here a few nights ago. Well, very early morning anyway. I specifically remember it had gone midnight. I'm an occasional insomniac, and it was one of those nights I couldn't sleep. Thank God Marcy started opening the diner 24 hours. It felt good to have somewhere to go in the small hours when I couldn't sleep. Also, there was guaranteed company. It made sense for Marcy to open throughout the night, seeing as our town is just off the busy highway. It cost her a small fortune to place an advertisement on the side of the road, but it paid off, as travelers and truck drivers alike often stop by for a much-needed break. I'd met some interesting walks of life in the small hours. It wasn't all drunks and sketchy characters, though they did make up a small percentage of them. It takes all sorts to make the world go round, and I love people watching, and people in general. To a point. I sat in one of the booths with a cup of decaffeinated coffee. That night the diner only had 4 customers, myself included. A late 50s male and female couple who were having a discussion about the best route to reach their final destination. They were dressed in shades of khaki and beige, both bespectacled and wearing matching Maine, New England baseball caps. They had a paper map spread out on the table, which was pretty novel to see. There was an RV parked outside, which I assumed was theirs. I chuckled to myself as I overheard them bickering. The other was a lone 30-something woman sitting on a stool at the bar, looking at her phone between bites of pie. She wore a black fedora, white blouse, and black skinny jeans tucked into a gray ankle boots. Waves of dark hair sat on her shoulders. She was sitting on a leather jacket which covered the stool. I promised there was nothing lecherous about my observations. People just fascinate me, and I absorb the appearances and mannerisms of those around me. Marcy walked over to me with a pot of coffee. She was sporting a blue gingham dress, her blonde hair tied up neatly in a bun, also a makeshift pen holder. I turned to her and smiled. "Third night in a row you've been on the graveyard shift," I said. "Are you a fellow insomniac?" A smile touched her lips. "Not me, hun. Janie asked for a few nights off, so I'm taking one for the team. I'll be out of here in, say..." She turned to the wall-mounted clock. 5 hours, then straight to bed." "Well, I thank you for your service," I said with a slight nod. "At least you don't have far to go. Out the back door and straight into the silver bullet." "And I'm so grateful for that." She put a hand on my shoulder. "You haven't touched your coffee, hun." I looked down and put my hands around the lukewarm mug. I'm only really here for the company and world watching." I turned to look out the window. The street bathed in a warm orange glow, though the world is pretty quiet tonight. "Can I at least fix you a little something to eat? Midnight omelet?" She laughed a little. Tempting. Though I would actually love a slice of cherry pie. "All right then, hun. I'll be right back." I turned to look out the window. I saw movement but realized it was the reflection of the woman at the bar. She had stood up and was walking over to my booth. I turned to her. She had a slight smile on her face. "Do you mind if I join you?" she said, holding a mug of coffee with her jacket draped over her arm. "Please do," I said, motioning to the empty seat with my hand. I'll never say no to company and conversation. She thanked me and sat down, placing her jacket next to her. I noticed a scar on her forehead, about an inch or so, that ran vertically through her otherwise perfectly shaped left eyebrow. "I couldn't help it over here," she said. "You have trouble sleeping?" "Yeah, unfortunately. Long-term occasional insomniac here." I raised a hand, guilty as charged. "I find it's better to get out and be around others instead of going mad at home. I'm becoming a creature of the night." She raised her scarred eyebrow. "Is that so?" I smiled a little. That sounded weird. "I promise I'm normal." Normal is boring." She smiled. Marcy came over with a plate, setting it on the table. "Here's your pie, hun." "Thank you, Marcy," I said, looking down at the glazed crust and enjoying the smell of rich, buttery pastry and sweet cherries. "I see you've made yourself a new friend, too," Marcy added. The woman looked up at Marcy. "I've been on the road for a while. I need to talk to someone other than Siri." She turned to me. "You really don't mind, do you?" "Not at all. It's my pleasure." She smiled and looked down at my pie. "In that case, could I trouble you for another slice? Best pie I've had this side of Chicago." Marcy smiled, one hand resting on her hip. If I wasn't so darn modest, I'd have to agree with you, hun. Coming right up. With that, she walked away. It really is the best pie this side of... I looked up, searching for the end of that sentence. You know what? It's the best pie. End of. I was about to dig in when I remembered my manners. Sorry, I'm Andy. I held out my hand. The woman reached across to shake it. Beth, she said with the same slight smile. Nice to meet you, Beth. So, you're from Chicago? That's exciting. What brings you here? I used the edge of my fork to cut a bite-sized piece of pie. Just passing through, really. I'm hunting. My eyes narrowed. Intriguing. What are you hunting for? I ate the small piece of pie I'd just cut away. She leant in closer, whispering, I hunt vampires. I started to choke on my pie as I tried to stifle a laugh, ending up holding a napkin to my mouth to collect any semi-chewed pastry that would otherwise get spewed across the table in my guest. The couple who still seemed to be disagreeing with each other looked over, annoyed expressions on their faces. I held up my hand to apologize, and they turned back to continue their discussion. Beth just stared at me deadpan. You know, I said, this is one thing I love about the night. There is rarely a dull moment, even in our humble town. She continued to stare. Her expression didn't change. So, forgive me for asking, is that how you got that scar? I tapped my own eyebrow, grinning. Yes, actually. It's dangerous work, and I'm sure you can imagine. I have a bigger scar if you'd like to see it, though I'd have to remove my blouse. I almost choked again and had a gulp of coffee in the absence of water. This is a family establishment, I'll have you know, I said, pointing a finger and smirking. What the fuck is so funny? She said, not a hint of humor in her voice. Her eyes burned into me. I was taken aback by her change in demeanor. I put down my fork and smiled awkwardly. I'm sorry, Beth. I didn't mean to upset you. I just really wasn't expecting that. She glared at me intensely. I could feel my eyes glaze over as my comfort level dropped and awkwardness crept up on me. I didn't know how to react. She slipped a hand under her jacket and pulled out a metallic silver steak. I'm more than upset, and I think you know why. She lightly touched the sharp point of the steak with a fingertip and held it up to me. A small drop of blood forming. My heartbeat began to increase as it became clear the situation was very real. She was dangerous. Marcy walked back over to us. Beth put the steak on the seat, quickly covering it with her jacket again and wrapping a napkin around her finger. She started laughing. Andy, you're so funny. Is he always like this? Oh, for real, hun? She said, putting down the pie. She put her hand on my shoulder again. You're in the presence of someone special. Not many like him. I looked at her and forced a smile, keeping up appearances. I didn't want to alert Marcy and endanger her in any way. I can see that, said Beth. She gave me an exaggerated smile. You two seem to be getting on well, said Marcy. Oh, like a house on fire, said Beth, her eyes not leaving mine. I just stared back, speechless. Marcy lingered for a beat. Well, all right then, said Marcy. Enjoy. With that, she left us. Beth started eating her pie like nothing had happened previously. This is so good, she said, mouth full. We don't want any trouble, I said nervously. We're good people. I don't know if this is some kind of joke or what, but you can't be pulling out weapons like that and threatening me. She put down the fork. Well, more like dropped the fork. It clinked loudly against the porcelain plate. Andy, I can see you think very highly of dear old Marcy. I get there's a connection, a history, and I know you wouldn't want anything bad to happen to her, despite your disgusting nature. I frowned in confusion and held up my trembling hands. I don't know who you think I am, but... She held up her hand and silenced me. Shut up. If you want Marcy to live, shut the fuck up. Do you understand? I looked over at Marcy as she wiped down the bar, lip syncing and bopping to the current 50s classic playing into the diner. Then I looked back to Beth and nodded. Just as soon as I've finished this amazing pie, you'll say goodnight, and we're leaving. I'm sure Marcy will assume it's because we both have... needs. I shook my head. And for what reason are we leaving? Don't play dumb. Your kind are so easy to spot for someone like me. It's in my blood. Speaking of blood. She held up her finger and squeezed it with the other hand, forcing a thin trail of crimson to trickle down. I grimaced a little. How does that make you feel? She laughed to herself, believing this was some kind of torture for me. Makes me feel like you're nuts. I'd barely even closed my mouth when I felt the point of the stake pressed against my inner thigh. I flinched and felt it penetrate my skin, sending a sharp pain through my leg that made my nerves spasm. I covered my mouth to contain a scream. Funny you should mention nuts. If you keep that up, you can consider yours skewered. I nodded in quick succession. Okay, I'm sorry. She pulled away from me, and I let out a sigh of relief. Credit where credit's due. I've never seen one of you resist blood like that. I'm almost in awe. Almost. I couldn't believe that she actually thought I was a vampire. I began to internally curse my insomnia for putting me in this situation. I slowly lifted my trembling hands and put them on the table. May I speak, please? I said quietly. There was a flash of anger in her eyes as one half of the bickering couple shuffled past us towards the bathroom. It was just a blurry beige spot on the peripheral vision. The distraction seemed to ease Beth somehow. Fine, she said, picking up her fork. Her other hand remained under the table. But choose your words wisely. She tapped the steak against my leg and dug into her pie. Can I ask why you think I'm... a vampire? I was almost embarrassed to say it. I don't think. I know. I'm from a long line of vampire hunters. We have a sense for it. I have to say, though, I actually wasn't expecting to bump into one of your kind so easily tonight. My parents are hunters, too. No one has heard from them in weeks. The last we heard, they were in this area following a lead. So I came to investigate. Now I've found you. It's looking a little bit too coincidental. The world works in mysterious ways. I looked at her, pleading. Please, Beth, I'm not what you think I am. Please. She considered my words. I could see a visible change in her expression. Tell me, how is it you're able to eat pie and drink coffee without being sick? I waved my hands around in frustration. Because I'm not a vampire. The male half of the main couple had emerged from the bathroom and stood next to us, staring in disbelief. What the hell kind of crazy are you folks? Lord have mercy. This is some backward town. He went shuffling off, shaking his head. Beth found it amusing. Yeah, Andy, what kind of crazy are you? 'Cause you sure as hell aren't like any other vampire I've met. The situation was taking its toll on me. I was under a lot of stress. And when I get heavily stressed, I find it hard to contain myself. My heart rate was too high. Adrenaline pumped through me. I faltered for just a short while. Barely seconds, but it was enough. Beth's eyes were wide with shock. She brought up the steak from under the table and held it out. The tip was coated in a dark green substance. What the hell? She said, confused. What are you? I panicked as I noticed the skin of my hands became translucent and took on a greenish hue, my nails stretching out into claws. I held them to the sides of my head as I shook it. "Leave," I yelled, causing the couple to turn around and scream. My fear began to turn to anger as I felt my skin vibrate and tingle. "Get out now." Beth held up the stake in a trembling hand and plunged it into my chest, knocking the air out of me. I screamed as I fell back against the seat, my chest on fire. I heard a shriek come from behind the bar. It wasn't human by any means. Marcy appeared, her face now showing what she truly was. Her neatly tied back hair had vanished completely, leaving a hairless, scaly scalp. Her arms were covered in dark green scales, her polished nails now claws. She leapt across the bar effortlessly. The bottom of her baby blue gingham dress revealed muscular scaled legs, her bare clawed feet now too large for the dainty heels she had been previously wearing. The main couple were hysterical. They ran for the door. Marcy seemed to defy gravity. She landed behind them and bashed their heads together, their limp bodies falling to the ground. I was a little woozy, but could see utter fear and confusion in Beth. She grabbed another item from her jacket. A gun. I tried to reach out to grab it, but I was too weak and slow. Marcy turned, leaping through the air. She shrieked as she headed for Beth. A single shot was fired. Marcy fell to the ground, screaming in pain as she writhed around. Beth held out the smoking gun, pointing it directly at Marcy. Her hand was shaking. "You know what?" I said. Beth turned to me with even more confusion in her eyes. A vampire would have certainly perished by this point. "I think I did meet your parents." Her eyes widened with terror as I showed her my true form. I clamped my clawed hands to the sides of her face and twisted her head from her shoulders. The fedora glided to the floor. Her headless body slumped against the seat. Her face remained in an expression of terror. You'd think someone who spent their life hunting vampires would be more open-minded to other supernatural beings. I threw her head aside and pulled the stake from my chest. It burned like a motherfucker, but the pain was already starting to ease. I rushed over to Marcy. A small pool of dark green blood formed around her leg. There was a small bullet hole. "Marcy, you good?" I said, putting a hand under her head. She nodded. I could see the pain was easing for her, too. "I'm fine, hun." She smiled. She looked around. "We have some cleaning up to do, though. Again." I smiled. "Just as soon as we're healed, I'll grab them up." The main couple were fine, by the way. We packed them unconscious into the RV, which I left on the outskirts of town. We're hoping they will be freaked out enough to not come back. And if they happen to mention it to anyone, it will just sound like crazy talk. We're generally not a violent species. Beth's parents were here all right, but they were looking for trouble. Small town nowhere, and we've had to deal with this stuff twice now. Vampires love the attention. They're so narcissistic. "Look at me, I'm sexy and immortal." Blah, blah, blah. You won't read about us in stories. We will never be part of pop culture. You know what? We're happy with that. We take the form of humans because it's usually the safest option. Most people don't really notice. But then you get the ones like Beth who are accustomed to spotting the differences. She mistook me for a vampire, but she knew I wasn't human. I understand the irony of posting this here. We are a very secretive species. I only tell of my experience as a warning. We mean you no harm. I cannot express that enough. But there's plenty of room in the desert for those who threaten us. Hello, I am writing to you in order to tell you my account of events most suspicious. I hereby declare that everything in this letter is a factual account of my experience over the past week regarding case number 1238 in Shelby Falls. If you have any questions regarding the case, please contact Dwayne Kanye at Shelby Falls Central Police Station. Though truth be told, you aren't going to get any better information than this. It all started a week ago. At first, it was like any other Monday morning. I awoke at 6 a.m., dressed up in my uniform, and headed downstairs for a quick cup of coffee and a few biscuits. While sitting at the table, I performed my own usual, personal little morning ritual, studying my officer badge intently and repeating my name mentally as I read it over and over again. It was a habit I picked up when I first joined the force in order to calm my nerves before the day began. Officer Albert Rogers. I almost said aloud. Seeing my name on the badge made me feel proud. I'm one of the few people who can say that they actually grew into the person they wanted to be as a child. Once my coffee and biscuits were extinguished, I made a trip to my mailbox to see if anything had come in from the weekend. I'm naturally a disciplined person, but I must admit that I often forget to check my mail regularly. Honestly, knowing what I know now, I wish that I had completely forgotten that I have a mailbox at all. Inside the mailbox was the usual assortment of spam and advertisements. Great. Maybe this is why checking the mail is such a hard habit to form. It rarely pays off. Initially, I was just going to donate all of it to the recycling bin, but there was one letter that stood out. It was a plain letter addressed to me, but oddly there was no return address. It had an old-timey wax seal that was pitch black in color, and had a mansion depicted on it. For a few moments, I was actually a bit excited. Was I about to be informed of the death of a long-lost relative whose fortune I was to inherit? A few seconds later, and my excitement turned to private shame. What a foolish thought. Life couldn't be that stereotypical, could it? But still, I found the mystery too tempting. That is the problem with detectives. Give us even a hint of a mystery and we're hooked. A character flaw, really, but a profitable one with the right resources. Grabbing a pocket knife out of my jacket, I carefully peeled the seal of the envelope. Seemed like a shame to break it. Inside was a standard A4 paper folded twice to fit in the envelope. The contents of the paper appeared to be a shoddy advertisement for a housing development project called Shelby's Retreat. Another one of those all-too-common garden home suburban projects. The ad had an amateurish picture of a happy family in front of a home. It honestly looked like it had been clipped out of a magazine. The letter read, in sloppy, weak handwriting, "We welcome you to Shelby's Retreat. We offer brand new, affordable quality homes that are perfect for first-time buyers, or those looking to make their pension go further. Act quickly. Houses are selling fast and you won't want to miss this opportunity." Below this was a date and time written for an open house. Today at 1 p.m. 1366 Waverly Drive was the address for the showing. I didn't see an agent to contact about this viewing, but at the bottom of the page, Shelby Real Estate Co. was watermarked. The whole note had me intrigued. Why go through the trouble of adding a wax seal and making the letter look fancy when the contents were so unprofessional? Perhaps I was overthinking it. Anyone can buy wax and get a little stamp these days. The note was amateur quality through and through then, though the unconventional nature of it did make me want to open it, so perhaps it was a very effective marketing after all. I chucked a little thinking of some poor intern at Shelby Real Estate's offices having to play 4D chess with this advertising campaign. I discarded the note in an envelope with the rest of the trash, and proceeded to have a completely uneventful commune to my station. Once at my desk, I began looking through the reports of the day. Several immediately caught my eye. People had been reporting receiving creepy unwanted mail in their mailbox. One report included a picture, and I had begun to suspect the envelope they received had the same black wax seal on it. The contents of their letter was different from mine. Seemed like the letter was trying to invite them to a birthday party. It had the same crappy graphics that were clearly pasted from a magazine. There was also a date and time which was legible. But I was able to barely make out the address. 1366 Waverly Street. Other detectives in the force probably wrote these reports off as some prank by kids. But my gut told me that there was something more sinister to this. I booted up my computer and typed in 1366 Waverly Drive and Shelby's Retreat. No hits for any articles on Shelby's Retreat, but it seems that the neighborhood did exist on Google Maps. I called Shelby Real Estate and inquired about the open house. A sweet voice on the other end of the line told me that they had no recollection of an open house for that address. If Shelby's Retreat did exist, it was not in their files. This was beginning to look suspicious enough to investigate further. I entered the new case file into our system for the letter I received, case 1238, and began driving towards the suburb to do an initial investigation. The sky was completely dreary when I left. What started out as a sunny October morning became a gray, cloudy mess with an annoying drizzle of cold rain. The kind of drizzle that made you turn on your windshield wipers for one swipe before waiting 3 or so minutes for it to accumulate enough to justify another. Once I had gotten to the periphery of the suburb, I slowed my vehicle down to a leisurely crawl so I could absorb the details of my surroundings. From the outside, the suburbs looked mostly complete and built. However, there was no sign at the entrance giving a name for the neighborhood. Who knew if this was even Shelby's Retreat? Well, if Shelby's Retreat even existed, of course. Driving into the main arterial road for the suburb, I noticed that most of the houses had well-kept lawns, and their exteriors looked freshly built. But there was no sign of inhabitants for any of the dwellings. No cars in the driveways, no lights on in the house. For such a gray day, they should have been visible from the outside, I thought. I began driving down the minor streets to check more houses, but it was all very much the same. New houses, no inhabitants. Perhaps the letter was correct. These houses were so newly built that no one had even moved in yet. Going to the 1366's open house might provide more answers, I thought. It was on Waverly Drive that I saw the one and only sign of life in the neighborhood. In the driveway of 1364 Waverly Drive, the neighbor of 1366 was a beaten-up looking car. There were still no lights in the house, however. Whoever lived there must have had 2 cars and took one out for some chores, I thought. Then I noticed a peculiar string of yarn hanging out of 1364's mailbox. It was tethered to the inside of the mailbox, and it went all the way to the front door of 1364. I couldn't help but think, God bless America. Here was someone so lazy that they devised a system to get their mail without ever leaving the comfort of their home. Perhaps I could use such a system to check my own mail. Would make it less of a hassle. Funny thinking with that one pull of a rope I could dump all of those ads while drinking my morning coffee. Turning my attention back to 1366, I noticed that there was a distinct lack of guests or even a real estate agent waiting outside of the house. As I began to approach the main entrance of the house, I experienced the all too familiar tingling of adrenaline. Something about this seemed so off. A neighborhood with only one inhabitant, an open house with closed doors and no welcome party. It did not feel right. What if this was an elaborate setup for a mugging? The more I looked at the facade of 1366, the more hesitant I became. My mind started playing silly tricks on me in order to get me to turn heel. It tried to convince me that the 2 front-facing windows, dark from the lack of lighting, were actually windows into the abyss, or the cold, dead eyes of a predator that feels no remorse as it sinks its teeth into its prey. The wind was starting to pick up now, and, combined with the freezing rain, I had to make a decision. This was supposed to be an open house, or a birthday party after all, so there should be no harm taking a peek inside, and I should be safe. I had a gun with me after all. If this whole suburb was some den for crackheads or thieves, At least I had some protection. As I began walking towards the front door, I saw some movement from the corner of my eye, but it was not coming from 1366. I looked to the left and studied a window from the side of 1364. There was an elderly man with his face pressed into the window glass. When I moved my hand to the doorknob of 1366, I saw his hands move to the front of his face. At first I thought he was about to shout something, but it seems that he was praying. Though it was hard to tell from a distance, I could have sworn that a uniform trickle of tears were rolling down his face. Was my mind just playing tricks on me once again? I yelled out to him that I was an officer and asked if he needed assistance. He looked wide-eyed at me and ducked below the window. I walked up to the window, but it was too high for me to peek down into his house. I knocked a few times asking if the old man needed my help, but I received only silence. I continued to listen. Silence. Silence. The wind blowing between the houses, raindrops hitting the vinyl sidings of the house. Silence. After about a minute I turned around to return to 1366, but as I did so I heard weeping prayers to Jesus and Mother Mary coming from the window behind me. Christ, that's sad, I thought to myself. The man must have had dementia or some other illness and was probably abandoned by his caretakers for the day. I breathed deeply and returned to the door of 1366. Exhaling, I opened the door and took my first step inside. The inside of the house looked impossible. It was much larger than the outside would imply, and the interior decoration looked ancient, like an old mansion you'd see in fairy tales or on Disney rides. It was almost completely dark save for a few candles that lined a grand stairway in front of me. At the top of the staircase was some kind of altar flanking by smaller staircases that led to the second floor of the house. A house that was clearly only a single floor from the outside. I thought it might have been the darkness playing a trick on me, but this was far too elaborate to explain away with the mere movement of shadows being processed by an anxiety-laden mind. I did not go back. I could not go back. There was something compelling me to look at the altar on the stair landing. Step by step, I walked up until the altar's contents came into view. It was another letter with an identical envelope to the one I and so many others had received. I did not take time to carefully open this one. I hastily ripped its contents out. Unfolding the paper, I saw a message in rather fancy cursive writing. In this house full of dread, not many are willing to tread, but you have entered instead, giving me my daily bread. All this for some high school poetry? I shrieked out in anger. My voice bounced off the far walls and ceiling of the foyer. I threw the paper on the ground in frustration and stood there breathing heavily. Once the echoes of my anger had subsided, the only sound to be heard was the whispering of the wind and the plip-plopping of rain outside. The rain seemed to get louder, and louder, and louder still until it was no longer rain. It was the sound of heavy boot steps coming from the stairs behind me. I could not make out much in the darkness, but each step was getting louder and louder, like a body being slammed to ground with each step to some unseen being's gate. I pulled out my gun and pointed it into the darkness. I'm Officer Rogers, a member of the Shelby Police. Lay down on the ground and identify yourself. There was no noticeable change in the rhythm of footsteps. They continued until suddenly I saw it. 2 feet wearing a familiar set of shoes entered the dim candlelight of the staircase. As they slowly shuffled down the staircase, their torso was revealed, and in 2 more steps, I saw its grotesque face. Only, it was my face, and my body. Except my eyes were not my eyes. They had been replaced by 2 of the black, waxy seals as seen on the envelopes. They were halfway melting, and the resulting black drip, giving the beast a weepy appearance. It raised its hand, and from its index finger grew a long, curved blade. It was probably 1/2 meter in length. its steel glowing a pale orange from the candlelight and casting a long, serpent-like shadow on the wall. The sight of my armed doppelganger was too much, and I fired 2 shots without hesitation. Both went through the chest, but the monster did not react. It kept its slow pace and continued plodding towards me. I breathed in deep and honed my sights for the creature's eyes, those damned eyes that made a mockery of my visage. With 1 shot, I popped off the seal from the left eye of my worse half. Instead of staring into a bullet wound from where I shot the creature, I found a glowing red eye staring back at me. The unblinking red eye that pulsed like the embers of dying fire had me so completely entranced that I did not notice that this crazed version of me was within arm's reach. It was too late. I looked down at the creature's silver-orange blade was sunk deep into my belly. I saw my blood trickle out from my sweater and jacket. It seemed to follow its own path rather than the one dedicated by gravity, running down the blade and then up the arm and body of the creature until it flowed into that red eye. Then it simply retracted its blade and disappeared. I looked down at my stomach and the wound was gone. I felt weak, but I could still stand. Looking at the altar, I noticed a new letter sitting upon it, tempting me to give it another read. Screw this. I ran to the front door and yanked it open. The outside all looked the same, except that the car in front of 1364 was now gone. I guess the old man was capable of leaving by himself after all. Using the remains of my might, I dashed to my own vehicle. However, the further away I got from the house, the greater a pressure I felt in my chest. It became harder and harder to breathe as I approached the handle of my car. Nonetheless, I made it inside. Looking into the rearview mirror, I made a sick discovery. My skin looked parched and my hair was graying. It was as if I had aged 10 years. Perhaps that's also why I felt weaker. I fished the keys out of my pocket. I was about to stick them in the ignition when suddenly I had a premonition of the car blowing up as soon as the metal connected. My heart starting palpitating harder. I would need to run instead, but outside the car stood 2 ravens in the street. If I tried to run, they are going to dive into my eyes, I thought. I knew, chest pounding more frequently now, I could see it clearly. Those birds would fly into the sky and then dive bomb directly into my eye sockets. I hear a crash coming from the rear window of the car. Chest was practically collapsing now. A hooded man with a trench coat, jacket, broke through the window and is connecting hundreds of pipes to the car exhaust. I will suffocate in this car. I looked at my badge. It has always been my savior, my soothing ritual. Albert Rogers, officer. I repeat over and over, but the heaviness I feel in my chest is no longer bearable. My only hope is the house. It just has to be. I quickly discard the badge and explode out the car and towards the house, ripping the doors open and slamming them shut behind me. My chest eases. I can breathe again. I look out the window. There is no sign of my earlier assailants. Taking a few moments to breathe and let it all sink in, I realize that there is nothing more for me to do than read the expecting letter. Thump, thump, thump. I drag my feet up the stairs, mimicking the menacing mimic who had assaulted me minutes earlier. I put a heavy hand on the altar end. With the other, picked up the envelope. This time I opened it with diligent care. Inside I found a set of rules and directives. Come to me, sweet lamb. Feed me and sustain me. You are one of my prisoners. In a jail with but one escape, bring me another to the dreary home of 1368. So, here I am a week later. I am but a shadow of my former self. Every night at midnight, my red-eyed doppelganger takes another piece of me. I grow older. My body and heart grow more frail. I've tried hiding, but it always finds me. I've tried going outside, but I am only strong enough to get to the mailbox before the hallucinations begin and I start wheezing. I wish I took that rope from 1364. It would have given me a great assistance in getting to and from the mailbox. But I believe I have figured out how this curse operates. In order to free myself, I just need to invite another to the neighboring house. Have this evil spirit, beast, or whatever take them instead of me. That's how the being gets fresh food. I once asked what would happen if I simply choose to rot away, and the being responded that they know how to ration. I could live my whole lifetime in this agony. I have tried to end myself, but every time I try to do so, I get these strong feelings of hope, praying that one day a stray car will pass by and maybe, just maybe, someone will wander into the house at 1368 and pick up that letter. I have now resigned myself to send letters, much like the one I am writing now, to curious individuals. I'm not like the host of 1364. I do not want to trick you. I am writing my full account so that you know what you are in for. So come on, all you paranormal investigators, puzzle solvers, and wannabe witchers. Won't you be my neighbor? Diane. My name is Diane. Yes, and I'm 17 years old, or at least I was back when I first stepped foot on this hell on earth. Judging by the reflection I can see of myself through the phone I'm using to write this, I still look like a teen, so I think I'm still more or less right about my age. But enough about me. The purpose of this written document is for it to serve as a proof of my existence and as a warning for anyone to not commit the same mistake Chloe and I committed when we foolishly decided to enter the accursed building. I'd tell you where it's located, but I don't trust my memory enough to provide a precise location aside from it being somewhere in France. I could ask Chloe, but I'm afraid that won't do. Let's just say she's not in the mood to answer any questions right now. It's kind of fascinating how I can still recall the events that led me to the moment rather vividly, despite all the details I'm already starting to forget. That's why I must tell my story to whoever is willing to read it while I still can, because I cannot guarantee that will still be the case tomorrow. My friends and I were what you could call casual horror enthusiasts. In other words, we weren't like some other people which were highly passionate about a particular horror novel or movie franchise or anything like that. But we did enjoy to occasionally gather together, make some popcorn, and watch a horror film once in a while, as well as watching creepy web series and creepypastas on the internet. That was the kind of horror we liked the most, because it felt more relatable in a strange way. Like it could happen to anyone who is just walking around an unnerving environment filming it with their phone or a cheap camera. That vibe is what made that type of horror uniquely scary in a way big blockbuster movies could not achieve. And it was that relatability and accessibility of that low-budget horror media that made us dream of making our own creepy short films someday. The opportunity finally came to us when our teacher assigned us a group project which consisted on shooting a short film that had to take place in a remarkable corner of our town with a particularly interesting history or function associated to it. And so, Chloe, Juliet, Camille, and I started brainstorming ideas. We all agreed our film should be a horror film, but we could not come to an agreement regarding where it should be filmed. We could film it in that forest right outside the town. It has an eerie atmosphere, and I've heard it has a history with some messed up things having happened there, Camille suggested. No. I promised myself years ago I would never step foot on that place. Not again. Juliet nervously protested, going pale the second the forest was mentioned before keeping silent and thoughtful for a few seconds. She was a good friend, but she was somewhat of an introvert and could be a bit of a weirdo at times. I hadn't seen her so agitated since that time she suffered a full-on panic attack and broke into tears at a slumber party after I pointed out a hallway in my house looked like a dark tunnel. She probably had her reasons, but I'd be lying if I told you I knew what these were. Okay. Any other ideas? I asked. Oh, I know. We could do it in that building located in the outskirts of town. I think it's abandoned, and it looks to be the perfect setting for our horror project, Chloe said. We all agreed Chloe's proposal was great, and so we decided to meet after school and inspect the building first before properly starting to film our short film. However, right after we had made our choice, we realized how little we actually knew about the place. It looked like a generic rectangular building, unsuspectingly sitting atop a hill in the outskirts of town. It had been there for as long as I or anyone I knew could muster. Countless local children had asked about the mysterious building to countless adults across the town for years, but no one was able to provide any relevant information about the place other than the fact it existed. The situation would be understandable if the building had been constructed long before any of the town's current residents were alive to witness it, but it didn't really look to be that old. I had always speculated it might have been from around the 1950s or 1960s, judging by its aesthetic. This wouldn't exactly make it a new building, but it would surely still be recent enough for plenty of people still living in present day to have lived during its construction and to at least know a fraction of its history. And yet, it was as if the whole town had collectively forgotten all about it and had accepted its existence as something as natural and unquestionable as the hill it stood on. It was precisely this mysterious, almost mystical context surrounding the place which convinced my friends and I it would make for the perfect setting for our project. Aren't the others coming? I asked Chloe upon arriving at our designated meeting spot, and seeing she was the only one there aside from me. Camille says she forgot she had to babysit her neighbor's kid, and Juliet has to go somewhere with her mother. They've told me they'll come with us the day we'll actually begin to film the project, but since we're only going there today to check it out beforehand, they decided they had more important things to do. Or in other words, they've chickened out, Chloe explained jokingly. And thus, Chloe and I climbed up the hill in the outskirts of town and approached the ominous abandoned building. It was a large rectangular-shaped, two-story building with 2 rows of boarded-up windows. It was coated with a layer of orange paint that looked to have once been bright and vibrant, but it was clear the passage of time and the years of neglect had taken a toll on it, as it had since turned dull and dry. So much so that a substantial portion of it had either peeled off the walls and fallen off, or was in the process of doing so. The large wooden door at the front of the building was safeguarded by a withered and rusty lock that prevented us from entering, or at least it did until Chloe started to kick it repeatedly, again and again and again, until the lock fell to the ground and the door was locked no more. Isn't this kind of illegal? I mean, we've just brought down a locked door using force, I uttered, feeling slightly concerned. Diane, please. It's been so long since someone cared about this place, nobody in town even remembers anymore. Not even the local police. You can't break a law in a place even the people that enforce the law have forgotten about. Chloe assured as I took a deep breath, and we both marched inside the abandoned building. The inside of the building was even more ominous than the outside. It was a series of long hallways branching out into multiple small rooms, most of which were empty and served an unclear purpose. It felt disturbing, but also serene in an odd way. This will be an awesome setting for our short film. We're most likely the first people to walk around here in decades. Our friends, the other two. I pity them for missing out on this. Chloe excitedly exclaimed. Don't you mean Camille and Juliet? I replied in concern. Oh, yeah, Camille and Juliet. I'm sorry. My brain collapsed for a second there. She uttered and nervously giggled afterwards. And Chloe just randomly forgot the names of 2 of her best friends. She had never shown any signs of having a weak memory before, and she's known Camille since kindergarten. Juliet moved to our town 2 years later, but still, Chloe and I hung out with both of them almost every day. This was the first time something like this happened to her, and it came so suddenly I couldn't help but feel alarmed. We roamed the building's desolate ground floor for a while without finding anything worth pointing out. Just more empty rooms and corridors, until we stumbled into a staircase that seemingly led to the building's upper floor. However, we didn't immediately direct our attention to it, as there was something else right next to the staircase which instantly left us paralyzed the moment we saw it. It was a sentence crudely written on a wall which read, "If you can still remember where the exit is, get out of here while you still have the chance." "Hey Diane, you do remember where the exit is, right?" Chloe worryingly uttered as I was still in the shock processing the message we had read. Of course, Chloe. It's, I replied as I struggled to come up with an answer, and I stared at the network of branching pathways and secluded chambers we had been traversing for the past 30 minutes or so. Now that I was staring at them like that, I realized the building's interior looked to be much bigger than I had originally expected when Chloe and I first saw it from the outside, although I honestly couldn't tell if it was just my paranoid memory playing tricks on me, or if it was something else. Thump, thump, thump. An ominous sound suddenly echoed from upstairs, as I was still trying to formulate an answer to Chloe's question. It sounded like footsteps. Both Chloe and I shuddered when we heard them in the distance. "Listen, why don't we go to the upper floor? Maybe those sounds are from some urban explorers who came here before we did, and they can help us find the exit," Chloe suggested. "How? Don't you remember the door was locked before we came here?" I reminded her. "No, I didn't remember." Chloe replied in a tone that made it sound like she was uttering that to herself as much as she was saying it to me. As much as I wanted to search for the exit and go home, I knew I had completely forgotten its location, or what path we had taken to reach that part of the building, or how big the place was. It was clear searching for the exit would only get us even more lost and confused, and so, having backed ourselves into a corner, we both silently nodded to each other and climbed up the staircase. While the ground floor was characterized by how barren and serene it was, the upper floor was quite the opposite. Its walls were filled to the brim with messages, much like the one we had found on the ground floor. "I'd cry for my mom if I still remembered her. The only thing I'll never forget is my regret to have come here. How much time has passed outside? Did my previous life even happen?" Despite the obvious signs of human presence, there seemed to be no sign of the source of those mysterious sounds which resembled footsteps we had heard earlier. "Diane, you need to take a look at this," Chloe said as she perplexedly stared at a collection of dozens of missing posters placed together on a wall like a mural. The posters depicted various teenage boys and girls, all of them with face expressions that clearly indicated they weren't having a good time. They didn't exactly look to be in physical pain, but they were certainly in discomfort, as if they knew they were regretting the decision to have entered the building, and were now sure they were trapped and weren't going to get out of there, or see their loved ones anytime soon. Beneath the images of the boys and girls themselves were written the words, "Missing, name forgotten, age forgotten." Thump, thump, thump. The footsteps from earlier could be heard again, but this time, they were significantly louder than before, and they grew even louder with each passing second, indicating whoever was the cause of them was getting increasingly close to our position. "Hello?" I shouted but got no answer. A pale, ominous figure revealed itself coming out of a nearby chamber seconds later. At a first glance, it seemed to have the overall appearance of a human, a teenage boy to be more precise, with an average height for what boys his age and a relatively slender complexion. His hair was brown, curly, and disheveled. It wasn't exactly short, but it wasn't excessively long in comparison with the names Chloe and I sported. However, upon closer inspection, It became clear there was something horribly wrong with him. His skin was unnaturally pale and his eyes seemed to permanently stare into a void only he could see, as if he was caught in a trance and his body spontaneously twitched every few seconds. It was then I realized his face looked very similar to one depicted in one of the missing posters we had just found. Only the face from the poster did not look nearly as sickly and decrepit. My gut feeling was urging me to stay away from him, but Chloe insisted in trying to talk to him and asking him for help. Excuse me? My friend and I have entered this building because, well, I can't remember it clearly right now, but we got lost and we don't know how to get out. Can you help us? Chloe asked the mysterious boy after we both stared at him for a couple seconds as he roamed around the upper floor, seemingly without any rhyme or reason. Upon hearing Chloe's voice, the boy suddenly began to grunt and aggressively put his hands on his head, as if he was in pain from a really bad headache, or was suffering a mental breakdown. He then turned to look at us and subsequently let out a scream unlike any I had heard before. It sounded like a terrifying mix of a painful moan and an angry yell. "Run!" I shouted to Chloe before we started sprinting through the halls as that creature began advancing towards us, moving in an abnormal, almost ghastly manner. His movements were erratic and seemed to have no regard for the laws of physics as he rapidly advanced in short bursts, almost as if he was a cartoon character whose animation frames were not complete, leading to unnatural and incoherent movements that almost made it seem like he was teleporting. Chloe and I frantically rushed to a small room with a wooden door and locked ourselves inside. We could hear the boy right outside the door as he twitched and growled. He then began violently banging on the door and attempting to turn the door handle several times, but Chloe and I managed to hold out with all our strength. "Who are you? What do you want from us?" "We just want to go home. Please let us leave, and we promise we'll never come back to this building ever again. I swear," I begged to the boy from the other side as the door, as Chloe and I broke into tears. But then, as if the creature had actually listened to me, the banging on the door and the loud growls suddenly ceased. Thump, thump, thump. Those dreaded footsteps could be heard again, but this time, they seemed to be getting farther away, from us rather than closer. Unbelievably, it appeared the creature was leaving us alone, for now. My phone was laying on the floor. It had most likely fallen off my pocket in the middle of that commotion with the boy. It was a good thing it did, as it actually reminded me I was carrying it with me all along. We're trapped. In here. This hellish place. I don't know how or why, but it's making us forget about our lives, so it can imprison us and turn us into mindless shells with no identity or purpose. I'm even starting to forget my home address. We're gonna be stuck in here forever. Diane, I want to say sorry. Before I forget, it was my stupid idea to have come here. Chloe uttered as she sat in a corner of the room and sobbed while she cradled her necklace in her hands, which her mother had recently gifted to her on her 17th birthday. Meanwhile, I quickly grabbed my phone and opened the text messaging app. I searched for the contacts of our two friends whose names I had already forgotten, but I was then reminded they were called Camille and Juliet thanks to their contacts, which I have saved in my phone. They were the only people who knew we had gone to the abandoned building, so if there was anyone from the outside world who could help us, it was them. Chloe and I are in the abandoned building. We're trapped inside. We need your help. I texted them. I'm sorry, but I don't recognize your number, so either you've texted the wrong person by mistake, or you're a troll trying to pull a prank on me, Camille replied. Who are you and how did you get my number? Juliet followed. What? Come on, I'm Diane. This isn't a joke. Chloe and I are in danger. We got attacked. Seriously, I'm begging you to help us. I nervously texted them back. I couldn't believe my eyes when I saw their replies. They acted as if they had forgotten about us. Nice try, prankster, but next time, try not to impersonate someone I actually know, Camille answered. I've never met anyone with those names, and believe me, I've been around for quite a while, Juliet replied. What was my name again? Chloe faintly asked in a rough, feeble tone, the kind you can only hear from someone who has lost all hope and is just waiting for the inevitable. Chloe, I replied. Thanks, friend, she uttered back. You're welcome. Oh, and my name's Diane, I clarified before letting out a forced smile in an attempt to make her feel better, which she returned with a forced smile of her own. Thump, thump, thump. Sounds like he's coming back. Thump, thump, thump. Thump, thump, thump. Thump. And there's more of them this time. Hello everyone, my name is Christopher. You can call me Chris. Something happened to me last night. Something unexplainable. I guess I should start from the beginning. I was born and raised in a small village that isn't marked anywhere on any maps, so don't bother asking for the name. You won't find it. Growing up in the village was exhausting, but I was a happy kid. There were some kids my age, and we would help our families with livestock and crops, and we would play hide and seek in our spare time. We never had internet, and I never really saw my parents or anyone from the village go to the town to buy any produce. The village is surrounded by a thick forest that stretched as far as the eye can see. There was nothing remarkable about the village except for one thing. There was a big pond situated on the far left side of the village. Now, the only reason I say it's remarkable is because kids, or even some adults, were never allowed to go near it. As a kid, I never questioned it. I did as my parents said, but as the time moved on, I got more and more curious about the pond. That's why one night when everyone went to their homes to sleep and rest after a hard day of work, me and a group of my friends decided to sneak out and see what's so special about the pond. We all grouped up near the center of the village and headed out to the pond. Why do you think we're not allowed near the pond? You think there are monsters there? One of my friends said shakily, and I could tell he regretted sneaking out. I have to admit, the village was pretty scary at night. Everything was silent except for our footsteps and heavy breathing. Monsters don't exist, Billy. They probably just don't want us to get hurt. After all the rains, the pond is probably very deep, I said, reassuring him and myself at the same time. We continued walking, and soon after, we were there. The water in the pond glistening under the moonlight like hundreds of fairies dancing. So, what do we do now? I said, feeling dumb that we hadn't even talked about what we were going to do when we got there. Maybe just sit near the water and talk for a bit under the moonlight. It looks beautiful. Veronica said, and she was right. It was beautiful. Veronica was my crush ever since we were kids, so I jumped at the opportunity to spend more time with her. I agree, we should do just that, I said, and took a seat next to Veronica, who was already sitting down. The rest of our friends joined us and sat there for 10 minutes until we heard a sound coming from behind us, and all of us snapped our heads back in unison. I think we made it clear that pond is off limits, a large man who stood before us said in an angry tone. It was the village elder, Francis. He grabbed Billy by his collar and threw us on the ground behind him. We're going to make an example out of you. The rest of you can consider yourselves lucky." He said in a tone that sent chills down my spine. I was afraid. I was afraid of what was going to happen to Billy. We all went home, and when I got to my house, my dad was standing outside, a big branch in his hands. "You dare make our family's name look bad?" he yelled as I started to sob. I got beaten by that branch until it snapped in half. My legs, my arms, my back, everything was swelled up, blue as the night sky we looked at. While I was on the floor, too weak to even sob, on the verge of passing out, my grandfather came in the room. "I'm so sorry this happened, Sonny," he said in an apologetic tone. As he pressed a bag of ice on my bruises, he took care of me for the rest of the night, always checking if I had a fever and giving me plenty of water to keep me hydrated. My grandfather was a good man. He was strict but always caring, and he never resorted to violence if he didn't have to. A polar opposite of my dad, who I assume felt enjoyment by beating me half to death, judging by the huge grin on his face while doing it. Next day I was too weak to even work, so I was in my room most of the day, only getting up to eat, drink, and go to the bathroom. As I was ready to take my third nap of the day, I heard something coming from outside. It was a voice, but it was hard to hear, so I opened my window to hear better. "So I call everyone over the age of 20 to come and witness what happens when you refuse to follow the rules that we followed for centuries before," I heard Francis say as my mind connected the pieces together. Oh no, what was going to happen to Billy? I said in a weak whisper as I tried to get up. I got up as every bone and every part of my body hurt from the relentless beating I took the night before. As I got to the door and tried to open it, I realized it was locked. Everything was locked. No, 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 come on! I yelled as I tried to open the door. It was of no use. I wasn't getting out until someone unlocked it. I laid back in my room, but this time I couldn't sleep. The thought of Billy getting a beating, or even worse, kept me up. I waited like that for what seemed like ages until I heard footsteps and crying outside. When I looked out, I saw a couple of people helping Billy's parents to their home as they cried. Where is Billy? I thought to myself as I heard another set of footsteps approaching. It was my parents and grandfather. My parents looked like nothing had happened, but I could see something was wrong on my grandfather's face. As they got in, my mom started making dinner as my father fidgeted around with one of his mini tools. My grandfather, however, came straight to my room. I looked at his eyes, which looked filled with sadness and sorrow. "Grandpa, what happened? Where is Billy?" I asked my questions frantically, desperately needing an answer. Grandpa looked at me and sighed as a couple of tears made their way down to his chin. "Billy is gone, Sonny. I'm so sorry," he said as another set of tears rushed down his face. "What do you mean gone? They killed Billy?" I yelled as he shushed me. "I'm not even supposed to be telling you about this. You're not old enough to know of him yet," he said as I looked at him, sadness and confusion filling my eyes. "What do you mean? Who is he? What have they done to Billy?" I asked him, hoping for an answer, needing an answer. "We are different from other people. We have a curse that has been here for generations. We need to follow the rules or else we may not be the only ones to be affected by it," he said in a defeated voice filled with sadness. "There is a tradition we do every year. I'll bring you with me. Hopefully that gives you answers you seek," he said after a long pause. "I should not be doing this, but you deserve answers. You deserve to know what happened to your friend," he said as he turned around to leave my room. He paused and turned around before leaving. "I will come to you when the day comes. Be prepared, my child." he said as he turned the knob and left, leaving me in a daze of emotions. Next couple of days I was working as usual, taking frequent breaks for my body to heal. I was still hurt badly. I didn't get much sleep either. Thinking of who or what he is gave me nightmares every time I fell asleep. A bit more than a month later, and I was in my room relaxing after yet another day of work. My grandfather came in my room. "It's time, Sonny. Follow me," he said in a worried tone as I almost jumped up out of bed. I will finally get the answers I desperately needed. It was already nighttime as we left the house, sneaking through the village, even though it seemed no one was there. As we neared the pond, I could see the whole village standing in a semicircle and saying some words I couldn't understand. As they chanted, something started emerging from the bottom of the pond. It was a huge dark figure, and as it rose to tower over us, a big yellow eye, almost the size of its whole face, opened up. As we were transfixed on the events, we didn't hear my dad coming up behind us, and he managed to grab me by the neck and throw me behind him. "You stupid old man, both of you will pay for this," he yelled as everyone looked at us, including the huge yellow eye. As my dad and grandfather brawled, I saw all of the villagers rushing towards us. "Run, run, and don't look back," my grandfather said as I turned and ran into the woods, tears flooding my eyes. I ran like that for hours, occasionally seeing a flashlight, a sign that they were still searching for me. Just as I was about to stop from exhaustion, I came across a road and an object with light coming from the front. That I now know is called a car stopped in front of me, and a man put me in the front seat. I passed out and I awoke in a hospital. I talked with the doctors, and after some tests, they called the police station to come pick me up to give my statement. We didn't really talk while I was in the police car, but after we came back, they took me in the interrogation room and 2 detectives came in. I was sure they wouldn't believe me, but after seeing bruises and tattered clothes, and after not finding me in their database as a citizen, they sent out a patrol to investigate the woods. After I gave my report multiple times, I was free to go, and that's how I ended up here on this website. I asked someone if there was technology to share my story to more people. They said go to the library and to find this website on the computer. So that's where I'm at right now. Writing this, hoping it would make me feel better about the whole situation. I don't know what happened to my grandfather, but I know that if it wasn't for him, I would have been the next offering to him. I'll start by saying that I'm not the ghost hunting type. I like horror movies and scary stories just fine, but by no means am I a AsDeathBeckons ghost adventurer. Call me a skeptic, or a realist, or even just a man with common sense. I don't believe in spooky Caspers or Ouija boards summon demons. I'm willing to admit now that I was partially wrong. Okay. I was very wrong. Let's start with a short history lesson. I promise it'll be short. The town of West Elm Park is nothing more than a very small blip in the middle of the Mitten State. My family owned some land and a nice little cottage there. It was our summertime destination every year, and I loved it. Picture any kind of summer vacation movie, and that's what I grew up with. We were right on a lake. We had the boats, the skis, the tubing, beach volleyball, you name it. Being that my parents didn't make a lot of money, this was extra special. They worked so hard so us kids could have one amazing week out of the year to enjoy. The town came into existence because of the location. West Elm is centrally located in Michigan, close enough to 4 of the 5 Great Lakes. Mr. Albert Stroh decided to found a cement company there. Albert and his brother Robert were most well known for creating Stroh's Brewery in Detroit, Michigan in the early 1900s. It's still a somewhat popular beer brand today, probably more widely available in the Midwest. Stroh's was one of the only breweries that started in Michigan. Now I'm sure it's owned by some multinational, massive beer company. Stroh thought that developing a cement mine and company would be a great idea, being that he could ship cement to all areas of the state. He foresaw that the horse and buggy era was coming to a close thanks to the Model T, and we needed to make traveling a little easier on these steel ponies. Dirt and mud roads weren't going to work. Cement was going to be the savior of the American transport system. He was actually ahead of his time with his thought, as asphalt concrete would become the norm for our roadway system. The only problem was that the men Mr. Stroh picked to run his company hundreds of miles away from his location in Detroit were not good. The company sank. This was all this town had, and the effects of this failure caused the once hustling and vibrant area to turn into an absolute ghost town. I guess looking back, I can now feel the pain in the air of this little town. There were many hard times after the concrete company fell. People tried to make it. Many did not. The murder house represents the struggle of the West Elm Park. I'm sure every town has one of these legendary haunted houses. Growing up, seeing this home across the lake from our cottage didn't mean much to me. Of course, it was the spooky house that me and my brothers would dare each other to go into, even though none of us had the nuts to do it. But I didn't feel the house, you know? Like I said, I was a skeptic. I only watched ghosts on TV for entertainment, not because I thought it was real. Fast forward some 20 years and I'm a full-grown man. Chest hair and everything. Me and my brothers sold the cottage after our parents split and left us with instructions to sell. Even split, 3 ways, and we never saw the place again. I haven't even seen my parents again. My mom used to contact me from Florida every so often, but that stopped a couple months back. Our dad went the other way, up north to the border of the US and Canada. Us brothers all received the same email from mom and dad, stating that they needed the place sold and, if at all possible, to never go back there. Let the place burn is what they said. Well, that's pretty frickin' dramatic for these people. My parents are hard-working blue-collar types, not ones to throw away an investment and speak of it like it was a pile of trash. I had so many great memories there. Why would they want it gone so fast? So, like I said, we did. And we never saw the place again. Something called me, though. I couldn't get over how abrupt my parents left, and how they wanted that house gone so bad. I haven't spoken to them for weeks, let alone seen them. The murder house flashed in my mind. I was pulled to it like strongman pulling a semi-truck. I had lots of questions about that place. Did it somehow get to my parents? What, am I crazy? Why the hell am I even thinking about this place right now? It was just an abandoned house like most of the places up there in West Elm. Luckily, I had some time off coming and I'm an amateur writer in my spare time. So why not take one last trip and really dive into this place? What's the worst that could happen? I thought. About 8 a.m., I'm sitting at a little diner right off I-75. It's the last place to get some fresh hot food and coffee before I make the drive to West Elm. Imagine any diner with the 2 lonely gas pumps out front in the middle of the desert. No desert in the Midwest, but you get the idea. The 70s style linoleum and the little stools by the bar were a welcome sight. We always stopped at this place before making the last few miles trip to the cottage. As the career waitress named Flo came to take my order, I decided to take a shot and ask if she has heard anything about a murder house in West Elm Park. I was studying her face, waiting for any kind of reaction. I think she squinted ever so briefly, but just gave me a silent shake of the head and asked what I'd be having today. The breakfast special was 2 eggs and choice of 2 links, patties, or bacon. That's when a burly man 3 seats down bored into my head. I wasn't looking at him, and I didn't notice anyone when I entered the diner. When Flo walked away, I had that feeling that someone was staring at me. I turned to my right and locked eyes with a guy whose name I'm sure is Ralph. He wore work boots, tight old man jeans, a plaid shirt with one of those puffy vests over it. Do these truck drivers get issued this uniform? I'm not a truck driver, he said. It took me a second to understand what the hell that meant. I didn't say that he was, at least not out loud. I'm sorry, is all that I could muster out. I live here. All my life. I'm not just stopping in to fuel up on caffeine and pie before I go on to my next 1,000-mile haul. I know the place you're talking about. It's not called the Murder House, though, as I'm sure you know. It's not called anything. No one knows about the history, at least not the bigger media types. I was floored. Yeah, it was a creepy house, but did it have an actual history? Name's Ralph. As he moved up to me and extended a hand that looked like 5 pounds of ground beef. Holding back giggly tears as I correctly predicted his name, I accepted the standard human greeting. What are you? A BuzzFeed blogger? Facebook writer? Twit, tat, Insta, whatever something? He kind of cracked a smile, which made me loosen up. Ralph didn't look as old as I thought. Maybe late 50s, so he must not be completely out of touch with the new tech world. No, just wanted to settle some things, I said. I then briefly went over my ties to the area and selling our childhood cottage. If you're going to go there, be careful. I don't know who or what lived there, but I do know there's nothing good about that place, he said. Ralph continued. I lived in West Elm Park, right on the edge of town, just a few miles away from that place on Elm Street. Wait, the house is on Elm Street? Okay, that's not a great start. A morbid coincidence maybe, but the murder house literally shares the same street name as the nightmare killer Freddy Krueger. I can hear the children's nursery rhymes as we speak. 1, 2... I decided to ask the most important question I could. So what makes it haunted? Is this some kind of axe murder thing like Lizzie Borden, where a factual crime happened that inspires people to feel uneasy when they're in that home? Or is this a paranormal kind of tongue-in-cheek legend among this small area of the United States? Ralph looked at the ground. It felt like he's been wanting to get the story out to someone for quite some time. You smoke? He asked. I didn't. You mind if we go out so I can burn one? I took him up on his offer. It was a real nice clear day, almost 70 degrees already, and getting humid. Not bad for an early June morning. We walked a few feet away from the diner. I took in the area. An area that I've been through for the better part of my childhood. The constant hum of the freeway, the smell of the fryers coming from the diner. The wide open landscape was soothing. Ralph packed a new pack of smokes, tore the cell phone, and lit a cigarette. As a boy, we had an Iranian housekeeper, he said. She was nice, but odd to us being that she was from such a foreign place, and her accent was heavy, barely spoke English. One day we were walking towards the lake. We never really went there. That was more of a tourist camping area. We didn't even know who lived there for a week, for a month at a time. My sister and I were throwing some kind of ball around, not paying attention to where we were at, being led by the housekeeper. Next thing I know, my nose hit the rather bulbous behind of this lady. I had tears in my eyes, about to look up to her with a bewildered state of mind when I realized she had come to a dead stop. Therefore, my nose was struck by her butt, you see. I wasn't paying attention, of course, and ran my silly ass right into her. Well, ass. I see him, she said. See who? He's hanging meat. There are scared girls inside. Now I wasn't concerned about my hurt nose. My sister and I froze, staring at the house. She went on. I can see the man, wearing an apron, butchering something. There's blood all over. Hanging meat. After a moment, she grabbed us and hurried back to our home. I threw that memory away for a long time, until I ran into an old story about that home on Elm Street. Apparently, it was where the butcher lived and worked during the cement company fall and rise. Ralph finished his smoke and tossed it into the gravel parking lot. I stood there waiting for the next part. And? I said. When? That's it, he said. So, this is what you're basing the murder house on? Did you go there and see anything, or feel anything? I wouldn't dare, my friend. That was enough for me. Disappointed but relieved, I thanked him and went on my way. If that's the worst thing this town has about the murder house, then there must not be much to this. I watched Ralph drive off and made my journey towards the lake. I was back in West Elm Park, on my way to the other side of the water I grew up around. I was headed on Elm Street, which I just learned was real. It was getting late now. I don't care. At this point, I'm going to go to this house, see if I can even get in, and maybe grab a few pictures. Let's put this to bed. Let me set the scene of 1313 Elm Street. Just kidding. The street address was something like 50012. But sure enough, it was on Elm Street. The Victorian-style home was larger than I remember. I never got up this close. I didn't get some sick feeling when I saw the place. It was a typical abandoned place. Grass overgrown, white fence looking gray and tattered. The windows were hard to see into. Taking a second, I looked around. No one. Dusk was complete. It wasn't pitch black only because the moon and stars were so bright. There were no streetlights out here. I checked my streamlight on and made my way up the 5 or so steps to the front door. It was already open. Hello? A faint voice said. My eyes were still adjusting to the dark. I was still in what you might call a mudroom. I was confused and now scared. That's when I saw them. I'm sure they were humans. Girls, maybe. Not sure if they were older than 20. It was still too hard to see. The inescapable putrid smell of meat hit me. Trying not to throw up, I accidentally dropped my streamlight. It stayed on, but rolled too far away from me. Composing myself, I dug my phone out and tapped the flashlight option on. Scanning, I didn't see anything. Help! I was almost face to face with a pale little girl. Startled and maybe soiled, I flew backward, falling on my ass. Staring at this girl with disbelief, I saw her slowly turn her head to her left, towards the inside of the home. I got the feeling that the butcher was coming. I did not want to meet anyone else in this hell home. I dove out the same way I came in, barely making it into the front lawn of Elm Street. I ran to my car. Once I got in, I broke out into that nervous laugh you get when you just went through a huge jump scare at the movie theater. I was also genuinely laughing that I had this idea to look through the murder house of my nightmares, and I only made it like 10 feet inside. How frickin' funny. And you even thought you saw little girls in there, and you ran from the butcher. That's rich, I must say. At this moment, my phone vibrates, scaring the rest of the you-know-what out of me. I check who's calling. It was my mom. Hello? You didn't go inside that house, did you? When I was a kid, I used to sleep over at my grandma's a lot. I was an unexpected baby and my parents weren't ready to say goodbye to their social life yet, so they dropped me off at my grandmother whenever they made plans with friends. I'd also spend a lot of my daytime at my grandma's because my parents also worked late. These two things combined made for an arrangement that I'd just say for my grandma for weeks on end. I didn't mind. I loved my granny very much. My grandmother, Granny Bunny, as I like to call her because of the countless rabbits that'd roam around her garden, lived in a cute little cottage. A gravel driveway, rose bushes in front of the porch, and big pine trees behind her house. The thing that fascinated me the most about it was the old well in her garden. Bricks and roof tiles covered with moss and very old bucket on a rope hanging from the mechanism attached to the roof. It came straight out of a fairy tale. She'd tell me stories about it, made up or real, I'm still not sure. She'd say she saw little fairies flying around the well at night. In hindsight, the fairies were just fireflies. One day I was sitting at the kitchen table, eating the sandwich my granny had just prepared for me. She was reading the paper and telling me about some of the things that were happening in the neighborhood. Some kid had tried to rob the local supermarket the week prior, and they had just arrested him. Serves him right, stealing from a local business. She mumbled as she was shaking her head. I wasn't paying much attention to what she was saying. I was fascinated by the bunnies in the garden. A brown rabbit was practically begging me to come out and chase it. "Granny, can I go look at the rabbits?" I asked her. She looked up from the paper and nodded. "But finish your sandwich first," she said as I was getting ready to get off my chair. I sulked a bit, but did what she asked of me. I was almost 5 years old at the time, but I knew better than to disobey my grandmother. As soon as I had my little boots on, I sprinted after the bunny that had caught my attention. Of course, it didn't appreciate it, and it started bolting away from me. It made its way to the well and disappeared behind it. I followed the bunny, but when I reached the other side of the well, the bunny had vanished into thin air. I walked a bit further and looked around in hopes of still being able to spot the bunny. It became clear that the animal had found a safe space to hide from my tiny hands. I pouted and decided I'd just look for another bunny to chase around the garden. When I heard a groan, I turned around, expecting to see my grandma sitting by the door to ask me to come back inside, but I was met by something I hadn't anticipated. Crawling out of the well, I saw a white figure with almost no facial features, just shadows where its eyes and mouth should be. It moved almost as if it were a spider, using its legs way more than a human would. It crouched next to the well and seemed to be staring at me, although I couldn't be sure because it didn't have any eyes. I stumbled back in fear. The creature got ready to crawl towards me, but when I blinked, it was gone. I kept staring at the spot I'd last seen it in, eyes wide open and a lump in my throat. When I blinked again, it was standing right in front of me, bent over so its face was aligned with mine. I screamed and closed my eyes. "Lola! Lola!" My grandmother came running for me and picked me up. "What happened?" I tried telling her what I had seen, but I wasn't making any sense and she didn't understand what I was saying. "It's okay, baby. Let's just go back inside." It's safe to say I had a horrible night's sleep that night. I was too scared to close my eyes because that meant the figure could creep into my room without me seeing it move. I only got some sleep after I crawled into my granny's bed and she put her soft arms around me. Nothing bad could happen when your grandmother was holding you. After that one time, I never saw the figure again. I made sure not to go into the yard alone anymore and would always ask my grandma to come with me when I wanted to chase bunnies. If she was too tired to come outside, I'd just stay inside and sit beside her on the couch, trying to understand what she was reading in the newspaper. Some days passed and the image of the creature vanished from my brain. I was able to sleep again without having to be in Bunny's bed. Peace had returned, but I spent the rest of my childhood avoiding the well like the plague. Fast forward to a couple weeks ago. My mother gave me a call and told me that Granny Bunny had passed away. I was defeated by this news and told my mother I'd travel with her to my grandmother's house to gather some of her stuff and arrange the funeral. The trip to her house was heartbreaking and emotional. My mother and I had to put all of my grandmother's belongings into boxes. I didn't know what my mom was going to do with it. Possibly donate it to some thrift shop or just throw it out. Maybe she'd keep some of it. I was standing in the living room holding a picture frame with a photo of my grandma and my grandpa on their honeymoon. I smiled softly and wiped a tear away. I was going to miss my grandma very much. "Lola, could you go and see if Grandma kept things in the shed?" The sound of my mother's voice made me look up. "Yeah, sure," I shouted back. She was in my granny's bedroom, throwing my grandma's dresses into a box. I put down the frame and went through the door that led to the yard. I had also played in the shed a lot as a kid. It's where Grandma kept the summer activities. An inflatable pool, some chalk, you name it. I forced open the lock that kept the shed closed and entered it. The cobwebs had taken over most of the inside, and the dust in the air made me cough. There was barely anything left from the old days. She must have gotten rid of it when I stopped coming over so much, I muttered to myself. I left the shed and closed it again behind me. I brushed some dust off of my shirt and turned around so I could go tell my mother that there was nothing noteworthy left in the shed. My heart sunk as I was met by the emotionless face of a white creature staring me down from behind the well. It crawled across the opening of the well, just like it had done when I was a little kid. I took a step back and felt my back press against the door of the shed. This time blinking didn't help, and the figure ran towards me on all fours. I made a run for the door and almost made it, but the thing got a hold of my leg and made me trip. I screamed and hit my head pretty hard. I don't know if I was actually unconscious or not, but when I opened my eyes again, my mother was crouched next to me, asking me what had happened. When I didn't reply straight away, she sighed and shook her head. "Can't trust you with terrain that isn't flat." I didn't disagree. It was easier to make her believe I tripped over my own feet than to make her believe that a faceless, white creature dragged me down. I'm just glad that my mother heard me scream, because I don't know what would have happened if she hadn't come running. I won't bore you with the details of what we did with my grandmother's belongings, house, or how the funeral went. The only thing that's important to tell you is that when they were lowering my grandma's casket into the ground, I blinked a few times to keep tears from streaming down my face. And during those blinks, I could see the white figure standing in the darkness of my closed eyelids. It made me shiver, but I shrugged it off. The last few days have been rough on me, though. I'm single and living alone. The only time I really have a conversation with anyone is at work. And I don't really feel like talking to my coworkers about the death of my granny, let alone the things I experience when I'm alone at home. The creature hasn't gone away like it did when I was younger. It doesn't appear to me in the way it did those 2 times at the well, but I can see him when I close my eyes. At first, this was very scary, but still somewhat okay. But now, it has started to terrify me. He seems to be getting closer. Yes, you read that right. Every time I close my eyes, he seems somewhat closer to my eyes, if you can call it that. He's standing in the void of my closed eyelids, but moves closer. I don't want to find out what happens when he reaches me. This fear has resulted in me forcing myself to keep my eyes open. I blink as little as possible, but it's starting to take a toll. My eyes feel incredibly dry, and they're very red. Today, my coworker asked me what was going on with me. She had noticed that I wasn't blinking much and told me that a few customers had mentioned it as well, saying it creeped them out how little I blinked. Can't blame them. I would also be freaked out if some woman was ringing up my items and barely blinked while doing so. It was what my colleagues said after that scared me. Severe cases of dry eyes could lead to blindness. I'm the type of person to trust my gut, and my gut was telling me that this was all very bad. I blinked, thinking this would magically cure all the dryness that my eyes were experiencing, and I quickly regretted it. The creature was now almost just in front of me, but something had changed about it. It no longer had no facial features at all. Now it had a huge, terrifying grin on its face. I think it'll kill me once it reaches me, but I don't even want to know what happens if I go blind. I fear it'll turn me into its own kind. My name is Kate. About a year ago, my wife, Kim, and I decided to take a road trip across the United States. She had inherited $20,000 from her grandfather's passing. We had just finished college and talked about using the money to buy a house. But neither of us had ever lived anywhere outside of Seattle, so we decided to take a road trip, see the country, gain some life experience, and maybe figure out what we wanted to do with our lives together. My grandfather agreed to look after our dog, Max, while we were on the road. On the day we left, we were dropping him off at her house and she seemed weird. My grandmother immigrated here from Ireland, and her parents when she was a child. She was raised to be superstitious, and I had always thought she was a little strange. But on this day, she was a little over the top. My grandmother hugged both and told us to be careful. There are things out there, things that you have never seen in the city, things that live in the shadows, and... I cut her off. Grandma, I love you, but we're going to be late. We don't have time for fairy tales. My grandmother looked as if she was going to say something, but stopped herself. She just nodded and hugged us both again. I left feeling like she had been trying to tell us something important. I know now what my grandmother was trying to tell us. People have been immigrating to the United States for centuries, and with them, they bring their culture, their beliefs, their folktales, and sometimes they bring other things. By the time we had hit the road, it was about 9 a.m. A couple of hours later than we had planned, but that was fine. We didn't have much of a plan as far as where and when to stop, but we had asked all of our friends for their advice, and we had quite a long list. We stopped at Leavenworth first. It was a quaint little German-style village nestled in the mountains. We had pretzels and bratwurst for lunch and spent some time browsing the shops. In one of the shops, Kim and I spent a good half hour trying on novelty hats and taking selfies together. The clerk asked if we were going to buy something or just spend all day trying on his merchandise. He was a little rude and I began to say something, but Kim showed me her phone. It was 4 p.m. We should really hit the road or we'll be stuck here. I removed the big top hat and handed it to the clerk and we left. What's next on the list? I asked Kim as we headed back to the freeway. She finished posting the pictures of us on Facebook and then pulled up the list on her phone. Greg said we need to hit up Winthrop, she told me. She pulled up directions on her phone. It's a little less than 3 hours north. Okay, I said. Pulling into Winthrop was like stepping out of a time machine. The main road was lined with old wooden buildings with wood plank sidewalks. It looked exactly like the set of an old western. We parked just off the main road and walked back to look at the shops. The wood sidewalk creaked under our feet as we walked from shop to shop. We spent hours browsing, looking at Western clothes and art in the stores, as well as several souvenir stores. Finally, we decided to get dinner. It was 8 p.m. now and the sun was starting to set. Given the Western theme of the town, barbecue was an easy choice. We ordered a sampler that had a little bit of almost everything on the menu. Let's sit outside, I proposed. It was a warm, nice summer evening, and I wanted to sit outside and people watch. We took our food and sat near the street. 4 men rode in on horses. They were wearing cowboy hats and chaps. If there hadn't been dozens of tourists wearing modern clothes, I would have sworn we were back on the frontier 200 years ago. The men stopped at the general store next to the restaurant. As they tied up their horses, I looked over to see Kim taking pictures of them on her phone. One of the men noticed this and tipped his hat at her. Howdy, he said. He patted his horse on the back and began to walk toward us. That sure is a big dog, Kim said with a smirk. He smiled and leaned against the log fence that surrounded the patio of the restaurant. You like horses? The cowboy asked him. If you're not already, you two should come to the rodeo tonight. It's right up the road. The cowboy pointed down the street. Kim and I both followed his gaze to the end of the street where we saw an arena. Jim, We heard a man yell and turned back to see another cowboy at the front door of the general store. "Jim, you coming or what?" the man asked. Jim gave us another smile and tipped his hat again. Then he walked back to his friends. "We should go to the rodeo," Kim said, beaming with excitement. "Yeah, you're right." I knew that neither one of us had ever seen a rodeo and probably never would again. It was a good opportunity for a rare experience, and that is exactly what this trip was about. The sun was setting over the trees at the end of Main Street, casting a series of shadows that sprawled down the street towards us like fingers. By the time Kim and I reached the hotel, it was dark. The hotel, like the rest of the town, had a rustic, Wild West facade. There were 4 lamps in the front that were made to look like oil lamps. The large door creaked loudly as I opened it. This place even sounded old. We checked in and were informed that we were in luck. There was one room available because someone didn't show up. We went up to the room. Kim said she needed a shower before we went out and asked if I would walk back and get the car. I obliged and began to head out. The walk back was like walking through a completely different city. I could see about a couple of 100 yards sheer from me where there were a few lights on the main street. And, through the woods, I could see some lights and hear some commotion at the rodeo. But where I was walking there was nothing. Even the moonlight had been blocked by the treetops overhead. I had a very unsettling feeling for some reason. I had always had this sixth sense, like a lizard brain feeling that something wasn't quite right. My parents thought I was paranoid or just had an overactive imagination, but my grandmother had always told me it was a gift. She said that I was just like her. Whatever it was, I was feeling very uneasy. Like there was darkness near me. I looked around but didn't see anyone. I suddenly felt very cold. It had been too warm all day to even think about wearing a jacket. I had even considered leaving my hoodie in the car. I was glad I hadn't. I zipped up my hoodie, though it did little to fight off the cold. I could even see my breath in the small amount of moonlight that fought through the trees. As I walked, I began to hear footsteps behind me. I turned and didn't see anyone behind me. I began to walk faster. The footsteps began to quicken behind me. I heard leaves crunch under the steps. I turned again and I saw movement. Not behind me, but off to the side. I could barely make out the shape of a large creature running through the woods. It was less than 100 feet behind me and gaining quickly. I began to run. The steps grew louder. They grew closer. My heart beat against my ribs and my lungs began to burn with each inhale of cold air. I could hear the creature come out of the woods and hit the street, and then sounds began to sound vaguely familiar. I turned to see what was chasing me. It was a huge black horse. The rider crouched low on the horse and kicked his spurs into its side mercilessly. I turned forward again. I put every ounce of strength I had into escape and my legs began to ache with the effort. I could hear the footsteps right behind me. I knew that any second now the rider would run me down. I waited for the impact, but to my surprise, the horseman rode past me. I watched in horror as he stopped 30 feet ahead of me and sat up, then pulled back on the reins. The horse reared back and its front legs kicked angrily at the sky. The horse let out a sinister neigh, and the horseman lifted a bearded axe into the air. But that isn't what made my blood run cold. It was what the horseman held in his other hand that chilled me to the bone. He lowered his axe and raised his other hand to reveal a head. He held it by the scalp, and even in the dim light I could see it wore an unnatural, inhuman smile that seemed to spread from ear to ear, revealing chipped, yellow, and black teeth. And where the eyes should be were dark, empty orbs. Not empty exactly. There was something evil in those dark, soulless sockets. I couldn't see, as much as I could feel that it was looking at me, and then it said something that meant nothing to me at the moment. Jim Fredrickson. I stood there panting for a moment. I considered running, but I wouldn't make it to the hotel if the horseman chased me, and I was closer to my car than the hotel. But I would have to make it past the horse. He was standing right in the middle of the intersection between the general store and the restaurant we had eaten at earlier. And then, the horseman seemed to relax his posture. He lowered the head and slowly turned his horse toward the woods and began walking in. This may not sound any crazier than what I have already seen, but they just seemed to fade away. They didn't disappear into the woods, but seemed to vanish into thin air before they got into the woods. I waited for a second to make sure I was in the clear, and to process what I had just seen, and then I rushed to my car. I ran all the way. As soon as I was inside, I locked the doors, and I sat there for several minutes catching my breath. I'd begun to warm up as soon as the horseman vanished, but I was still trembling. I turned the heater on. Once I was calmed down, I began to calm myself down. I started driving back to the hotel and was rehearsing what I would tell Kim when I saw her. I knew she would think I was crazy, and honestly, I had just about convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing, until I turned onto the main street and saw the telltale red and blue lights of the police car. It was parked on the shoulder of the road, right next to the spot where the horseman had stopped. Maybe someone else saw what I saw. I thought to myself. I slowed down and stopped so I could ask what was happening. A police officer was placing orange cones on the street. Behind him, I could see a body on the street. I got out and asked him what was happening. He informed me that there had been an accident. I saw a man on the phone next to the body. He seemed to be crying and having a very difficult phone call. I recognized the man on the phone. It was a cowboy from earlier. Not the one who had been talking to, but his friend. The officer had walked away to put up more cones. I took the opportunity to get closer and see who it was. The man was lying face down. His neck was bent at an odd angle that left his head laying in his shoulder, and his cowboy hat was a few feet away. The other man was off the phone now and seemed to be collecting himself. "What happened?" I asked him. He sniffled and took a deep breath to steady his voice. "Jim and I were riding over to the rodeo. Something spooked the horses. Damn things bucked us both off. I got lucky and landed on my back. By the time I got up and dusted myself off, the horses were gone. And Jim?" He paused. "Jim landed on his head. Broke his neck." I felt that chill again. Jim? What was his last name? The man gave me an odd look, as if he wondered why I cared. I saw him look over my shoulder, and I glanced back to see the officer coming our way. "Fredrickson," he said. I wanted to tell him what I saw. It's better that I didn't get a chance to. The officer interrupted me. "Did you get a hold of your wife?" he asked the cowboy. "Yeah, she has the trailer parked around the corner, and she is getting word to Jim's parents," the cowboy answered. "Ma'am, you shouldn't be here. We have paramedics on the way and animal control to help round up the horses. I'd appreciate it if you could get your car off the road. We're going to need space to get an ambulance in here, as well as keep traffic moving," the officer mansplained to me. I gave the cowboy one last look and offered my condolences. Then I was on my way back to the hotel. Kim could tell something was wrong, and soon as I walked in, she always seemed to know what I was feeling. "What's wrong, baby?" she asked. She hugged me and sat me down on the bed. "What happened?" she asked. I exhaled deeply. "I thought they were just fairy tales," I told her. "What?" she asked. She had a puzzled look on her face and rubbed my shoulder sympathetically. "What was just fairy tales?" "When I was a little girl, my grandmother told me fairy tales from the old country, stories she grew up with in Ireland. One of them was the Dullahan, and I saw him tonight." I cried out. "What are you talking about? What is the Dullahan?" Kim asked me. She looked much more concerned now. The story goes centuries ago. A soldier rode into battle. He lost his head in battle and came back as the Dullahan. He doesn't exactly kill people, as much as he comes to take them when it is their time. I proceeded to tell her exactly what I had seen tonight. The horseman, the fact that he had carried Jim's name, and then Jim died in the same spot. I waited for a response from her. She stared at me for a minute, and as the seconds of silence ticked by, I began to wonder if she thought I was making it up or if I was just crazy. Then she picked up my hand and held it. "Tell me more about these fairy tales," she said. I've been working at my local movie theater for a few months now. I needed a job very suddenly after getting laid off unexpectedly. It wasn't really the pay I was worried about. I just needed something to do other than sitting on my ass all day. And the theater was what came to mind. I'd always wished I'd worked at a movie theater when I was younger, so I figured now was as good a time as any. After a few weeks working there, I had really started to love it, way more than I had ever anticipated. I even stopped dreading interacting with customers and started to look forward to helping people out. But mostly, it was the routine, the rhythm almost, of crisscrossing across the lobby as efficiently as possible, cleaning and sweeping every theater in whatever order had been laid out for me. It was simple, it kept me busy, and that was all that mattered to me. Pretty soon after starting, I was pretty looped in on all the workplace gossip. This included normal stuff like who people thought got an undeserved promotion, or which manager was the most annoying to work under. But the gossip spread even further than that too. I quickly learned about the rats that had taken up residence behind the concessions area, or the back hallway stairs that supposedly were bad luck. Well, all of these stories were lighthearted and told to anyone and everyone just to fill time while we were on a break. One story I heard was treated entirely differently. My supervisor, a really laid-back guy who loved to gossip about anything and everything, pulled me aside one day out of nowhere. With a look of concern on his face, I was worried I had seriously messed up something earlier today, and was racking my brain for what I could have possibly done to be in this much trouble, when he just came right out and said it. Some people believe that Theater 9 is haunted. He told me that many employees had had supernatural experiences when in Theater 9 alone, often late at night on a slower day. They had seen things that terrified them into quitting out of the blue, or heard people inside only to enter the theater and find no one. He had one longtime manager was so convinced there was something unnatural living in Theater 9 that he refused to step foot inside at all. He'd rather be fired, he said. He told me all of this with such seriousness etched into his face, with such a stern look that didn't suit his usually casual and jovial demeanor. It almost sounded like a warning. This had gone far past the realm of ordinary office gossip. This was to be taken seriously. Of course, after he told me this, I didn't really believe him. Apart from the vague and generic nature of the story, I just couldn't believe that such a normal and put-together guy like my boss would believe in something stupid like this. Besides, I would tell him, I've been in there a million times and nothing's happened to me. He paused for a moment, a soft smile creeping across his face. Yet, he would say, nothing has happened to you yet. While those words shook me a little, I largely chalked up the interaction to some bizarre new guy hazing ritual, or some sort of new brand of comedy he was experimenting with. I paid no special attention to Theater 9, and it paid none to me. The building I worked in was divided into two main hallways, connected by a central lobby area where guests would enter to purchase concessions and tickets. The left hallway was much wider and larger, containing our premium theaters and formats on both sides of the hall. 8 theaters in total. The right side hallway was much narrower. housing the remaining 6 theaters spread out sparsely along the right side of the hallway. Since both hallways stretched the same length but had a different number of theaters, the left side hallway felt much shorter as you walked down it, as theaters were spread out much more evenly along it. In contrast, the right hallway contained theaters 14 through 11, fairly close together, then a noticeable break as you walked down to reach theater 10, and then finally, at the very end of the hallway, nestled away behind a piece of the wall that jutted out halfway into the hallway, located right next to the emergency exit doors, was theater 9. It was where the absolute lowest priority movies were shown, as the walk to get there was so inconvenient and confusing, and it was so isolated from every other theater. I used to enjoy cleaning theater 9, honestly. I enjoyed its quiet isolation. There was never a huge mess left behind, and I always got a good laugh out of checking what movie had been relegated to the sad and lonely theater 9. I don't anymore. I don't think I can ever step foot in there again after what I saw. Last Wednesday was slow. Unbelievably so. I was practically pulling my hair out all shift long, and it was a long shift too. I was dragging my feet back and forth between theaters, trying to kill as much time as possible when I realized I was running a few minutes behind. It wasn't a huge deal. Theaters on a slow day like today would take no more than 5 minutes to clean, but I always liked to be on top of the schedule in case it got busy later. Glancing down at my schedule, I made my way to the right side hallway and began the long trek toward theater 9. I passed a couple in the hallway leaving theater 9 as I walked toward it. "Have a nice night," I called out to them with a warm smile. They ignored me completely. As I walked the long stretch of bare wall and turned towards the door to the theater, I realized just how slow today was. Turning slightly to loom over my shoulder down the hallway, I saw absolutely nothing. There was no one around at all. The couple I had passed must have taken off running or something, as there was just no sign of them at all. Brushing it off, I wrapped my hand firmly around the cold metal handle and yanked open the door. Immediately, I noticed something was off. The credits were still rolling, but double-checking the schedule reaffirmed that I was right and that the movie should have been finished by now. Furrowing my brow, I continued to stare at the schedule. End time 12:15 a.m. It read, and then it was just blank. No start time and no movie name. I had never seen anything like it before and was debating whether to radio in and ask about it, ultimately deciding it could wait until after I had cleaned up here. As I stood in the doorway, listening to the soft piano track playing softly over the credits, I began to think about what my boss had told me just a few weeks earlier. Pushing down the growing sense of unease, I stepped into the theater. It was cold in here. I wished for the millionth time that day that I brought a jacket to work. I was always cold at work, and yet even after a month, I had yet to remember a jacket even one time. Cursing under my breath as I took a few steps in, gripping my broom tightly, and taking quiet steps in case there was anyone still in there. As I meandered down the narrow entrance hallway, more and more to the screen came into view ahead of me. As the wall to my right where the rows of seats were located began to fall away, reaching a point where the wall was low enough to see into the rows of seats into my right, I commenced my usual routine of peeking discreetly over the wall to check for anyone who was staying through the credits. If there were people still seated inside, I would need to turn around and wait outside until the credits ended or they left. If not, I could turn on the lights and get started straight away. As I scanned the still dark theater row by row, I thought I saw someone. Seated in the back row, it looked like there was a man. He had to have been 7-8 feet tall at least, hunched over in a painful-looking way with his head pushed as far forward as possible toward the screen. Just as I began to focus on his face, I heard my radio crackle to life, and he was gone. "Does anyone know if a regular popcorn refill is free?" was the question that came through my earpiece. I pulled the mic up to my mouth and answered, "Yes, it's free." When I checked the seat again, all that remained was an upturned popcorn bucket someone had graciously left behind for me. Relieved, I sighed softly to myself. The darkness of the theater has more than once made me see something that wasn't there. I must have seen the popcorn bucket from a weird angle, and maybe I was a little sleep deprived too. Relaxing slightly, I turned back down the hallway to hit the lights so I could begin cleaning. As light flooded the theater, an uneasiness faded away. I began to go over the rest of the schedule in my head, dreading the closing tasks I would inevitably be assigned right after I finished up here. As I stepped past the first row, checking for any trash, I realized I still hadn't figured out what movie these credits belonged to. Ascending the stairs to the first row, I glanced at the credits while I swept, looking for any clues. The names scrolling by gave me no information, and neither did the music, which had transitioned from soft piano notes to this gorgeous church choir-style song that I had never heard before. Fully devoted to this mystery, I took a break to sit and watch the credits for a bit. My eyes lazily tracked the flurry of names as they cascaded by. Nothing standing out to me. I started to pay closer attention. There were no logos, no descriptions, or headings. It was just a furious scroll of meaningless names that seemed to be moving faster and faster toward the top of the screen. They kept hurtling faster and faster, with more and more names filling up the sides of the screen too. The sharp white text had begun to overlap, and the names seemed to reach for the edge of the screen, as if they were about to spill out into the theater. Pretty soon the speed of the credits became too fast for me to track. The barrage of names was now just a blur of white that filled up the entire screen. I sat there completely motionless, eyes locked in front of me watching the screen fill with white. It was becoming less blurry now. I leaned forward in my seat. I could almost start to see something. I hunched forward as much as possible. Something beyond the white. I pushed my head forward as far as it would go. I saw a lake. Someone sat down next to me. I reached out to touch the water. He was impossibly tall. I waded carelessly through the lake. His skin was paper thin. There was something on the other side. His bones made disgusting creaking and snapping noises as he leaned forward in his seat. It was a heavy steel door. He stuck out his face towards the screen. I stepped out of the lake. The white from the screen illuminated his translucent skin. I stood in front of the door. I could see straight through him. I reached for the handle. He began to shrink in size. I grazed the cold steel. His skin grew darker, less opaque. I grabbed the handle firmly. His bones creaked and snapped again, shrinking to fit his new form. I pulled hard, but the handle didn't budge. Hair began to sprout from the crown of his head. I pulled harder. His skin had gone from translucent to a mottled brown. I felt something pushing from the other side of the door. His new piercing brown eyes stared pointedly at me. I continued to pull, and the force from the other side pushed in turn. His face was almost fully formed. His legs began to snap into place like puzzle pieces. I pulled open the door just far enough to see inside. He was almost complete. I peered into the doorway and watched an imperfect copy of myself struggling to push open the door. He stared down at his new fingers, as if unsure what to do with them. The copy looked up at me with a pleading expression plastered unfittingly onto its roughly formed face. He tried to lift himself up out of the seat, but he was still too weak. I stared desperately, pushing on the door. His mouth began to form. Etched onto his face was a mocking sneer. The copy started screaming. "It is free! It is free!" It repeated over and over again in a voice that began to sound increasingly like my own. He started to rise from the chair. I felt the door start to close as I put my weight into it. He stumbled before he could rise, falling back into the chair. The door was almost closed. Only the copy's arm stuck halfway out of the door. Weakened, he leaned toward me slowly. I shoved my shoulder into the door over and over until I heard a sickening snap from the copy's arm. He began to grow again, his skin becoming more and more opaque. The copy shrieked and removed its arm from the doorway. His bones were elongating, his hair falling out in clumps as he stood up and hobbled weakly toward the screen. The door finally closed shut with a heavy bang. I woke up in my seat momentarily. The only thing I saw was a pale white hand waving slowly to me from behind the projector screen. I passed out again right after. The next thing I remember was a coworker shaking me. He told me I had been sleeping in here for an hour and said that our boss was pissed I had missed out on helping with closing. Needless to say, I was terrified and skittish. I didn't say a word to him as I ran out of the theater. I found the first set of doors and sprinted straight to my car. I drove like a madman the entire way home, half expecting to see that thing everywhere I looked. I got to my apartment, locked the door, and sat petrified in the center of my room. I couldn't sleep that night. I couldn't eat for another day at least. I haven't left my apartment in a week. But even after everything I saw, that story isn't the reason I made this post. No, I made this post as a warning to all of you. You see, after a week of not leaving my place, I had begun to relax a little. I was almost ready to chalk the whole experience up to a complete and total mental breakdown or some sort of stress-induced hallucination. That's when I remembered I had missed an entire week of work without calling. Absolutely kicking myself for screwing up the job I had come to love, I picked up my phone fully prepared to give them the classic, unexpected family emergency routine and beg for forgiveness. But when my manager picked up and heard my voice, he didn't ask where I'd been or yell at me for missing shifts without calling. He didn't seem upset in the slightest. He didn't seem to care I'd ditched work. Instead, he just said, "Hey, you were acting really weird at work yesterday, man. Is everything okay?"